My father left me a farm buried in $8,000 of back taxes. I spent 5 years of my youth breaking my back to save it from the auction block. But the very morning it finally became a $1 million success, my older brother, who abandoned us years ago, stepped onto my property with a slick lawyer and a deed. He smiled at me and said, "Thanks for doing the free labor, I am claiming it now." Before I tell you how I turned his greedy ambush into his absolute financial ruin, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Drop a comment to let me know what state or country you are watching from today and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to the morning the nightmare began. My name is Abby Hayes. I am 29 years old, a freelance accountant, and the sole operator of Oak Creek Farm in rural Ohio. It was a Saturday morning in late September. The air was crisp, and the sun was just starting to burn the morning dew off the vast green pasture. But I had absolutely no time to enjoy the beautiful weather. I was running on 4 hours of sleep fueled entirely by bitter black coffee and sheer anxious adrenaline. Today was the single most important day in the history of my small business. I was hosting a $40,000 rustic farm-to-table wedding. It was the kind of high-end, prestigious event that could put my venue on the map for good. I had 150 guests arriving in exactly 3 hours, and the pressure was suffocating. I was practically jogging across the gravel courtyard carrying a 50-pound wooden crate of organic heirloom tomatoes from the greenhouse to the main catering tent. My heavy work boots were caked in dry mud. My old denim jeans were stained at the knees from pulling weeds at dawn, and my faded plaid shirt clung to my back with sweat. My hair was twisted up in a messy knot, held together tightly by a stray pencil. I knew I looked like a complete wreck, but I felt a fierce, burning sense of pride. Every blade of grass, every strung Edison bulb, every polished wooden table in that massive barn was the direct result of my own blood, sweat, and tears. I set the heavy crate down on the stainless steel prep table with a loud thud. The head caterer nodded his thanks and immediately started slicing the bright red tomatoes. Just as I turned around to catch my breath and wipe my hands, the wedding florist ran up to me. Her face was flushed bright red, and she was clutching her wooden clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Abby," she said, her voice pitching high with raw panic. "The wind is catching the main floral archway near the barn doors. If we do not anchor it better right now, the entire structure is going to tip over and shatter before the bridal party even gets here for photos." I told her to take a deep breath and promised I would handle it immediately. I sprinted across the yard to the old tool shed to grab a tall aluminum ladder and a handful of heavy-duty industrial zip ties. Running back toward the barn, I navigated through an absolute maze of chaotic activity. Servers dressed in crisp white button-downs were rushing past me, balancing heavy silver trays of crystal champagne flutes. A crew of young men was loudly setting up rows of folding oak chairs on the great lawn. The rich mouth-watering smell of smoked brisket drifted from the massive outdoor kitchen area. Everything was moving at lightning speed. The stakes were incredibly high. If this wedding went perfectly, I would secure enough bookings to finally breathe easy financially. I climbed the metal ladder and began securing the thick, heavy bundles of white roses and green eucalyptus to the wooden structural beams of the barn. I was just tightening the very last zip tie when I heard the unmistakable aggressive crunch of heavy tires speeding down my private gravel driveway. I froze at the top of the ladder. The bridal party was not scheduled to arrive for another hour, and all delivery trucks were strictly instructed to use the rear service entrance. I turned my head and looked toward the main iron gate. A brand new gleaming black Lexus SUV was tearing down the long driveway, moving far too fast for a narrow farm road. It kicked up a massive swirling cloud of thick white dust. The dust cloud billowed directly toward the manicured lawn, drifting dangerously over the pristine white linen tablecloths and the delicate floral arrangements my team had just spent 3 hours perfecting. I scrambled down the ladder so fast I nearly twisted my ankle. My heart started pounding with sudden intense anger. "Hey!" I shouted loudly, waving my arms in the air. "Slow down!" The luxury vehicle did not slow down. It aggressively pulled right up to the edge of the main catering tent, its expensive tires skidding loudly on the gravel, and parked directly in a designated fire lane. The heavy engine shut off. For a split second, there was a heavy, unnatural silence across the courtyard. Then the driver's side door opened. A tall man stepped out. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue button-down shirt, expensive khaki slacks, and pristine brown leather loafers. His hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place despite the wind. It had been 5 long years since I last saw him, but I would recognize that arrogant, entitled posture anywhere. It was my older brother, Brandon. He was 34 years old, the undisputed golden child of our family. Growing up, Brandon always got the new clothes, the private sports lessons, and the shiny new car, while I happily wore his faded hand-me-downs and started working a part-time job at age 15. When our father got sick and eventually passed away, Brandon was nowhere to be found. He had completely abandoned this farm, calling it a worthless, toxic pile of dirt. Yet here he was, standing on my gravel, looking around with a smug expression of extreme satisfaction. The passenger door opened and his wife Jessica stepped out gracefully. She was wearing a designer silk dress that probably cost more than my entire catering budget, paired with oversized dark sunglasses and strappy heels that were entirely impractical for walking on a farm. She held a tiny, very expensive designer handbag and looked at my beautifully restored barn as if she had just stepped in something foul. From the back seat emerged a third person. He was an older man dressed in a sleek, perfectly fitted gray suit. He carried a slim leather briefcase. He had the cold, calculating, empty look of a corporate lawyer. I stood frozen in the settling dust, wiping my dirty hands nervously on my jeans. "Brandon?" I said, my voice tight with extreme confusion and rising panic. "What are you doing here? You cannot park that car there. We have a massive event starting very soon, and you are throwing dirt all over the food prep area." Brandon did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not even look at me when I spoke. Instead, he walked casually and confidently toward the main catering table, where my staff was busy arranging the expensive appetizers. There was a large woven basket filled to the brim with fresh blue hydrangeas sitting near the edge of the table. Without breaking his stride, Brandon swung his foot and kicked the basket hard. The heavy basket tipped over, violently spilling water, and crushed blue flowers all over the dry gravel. The catering staff stopped dead in their tracks, staring at him in absolute shock. The florist let out a loud gasp and covered her mouth. "Hey, what is your problem?" I yelled, marching aggressively toward him. My hands were shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "Get out of here right now. You have absolutely no right to do that to my property." Brandon stopped and finally turned to face me. He looked down at my muddy boots, my stained work jeans, and my messy hair. A slow, deeply cruel smile spread across his handsome face. He reached out his right hand, and the lawyer in the gray suit immediately stepped forward and placed a thick manila folder into it. Brandon slowly pulled a heavy, stapled legal document from the folder. He slapped the document down hard onto the pristine white tablecloth of the catering station right next to a silver tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres. "Shut it down, Abby," he said, his voice loud, commanding and echoing across the entire quiet courtyard. I stared at him, my mind spinning in 100 different directions. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, stepping closer. "Shut what down? We have 150 guests arriving in moments." "Shut all of it down," Brandon repeated firmly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Cancel the wedding. Tell your little staff to pack up their knives and go home. This property is in my name. I am taking possession today." The words hit me like a physical, violent blow to the chest. I could hear the catering manager suck in a sharp breath of air behind me. The florist dropped her wooden clipboard onto the gravel with a loud clatter. Every single person working in that courtyard had stopped moving. 30 pairs of eyes were staring directly at us, witnessing my complete and utter humiliation. "You are completely out of your mind," I said, my voice trembling uncontrollably as my face burned hot with embarrassment. I stepped closer to the table and looked down at the paper. It looked incredibly official. It had blue county seals and black ink stamps all over the top page. I took a step toward my brother, my fists clenched so hard, my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. You left this place 5 years ago. You packed your bags the day after Dad's funeral and ran to Chicago. You stood in our kitchen and called this farm a toxic liability. You left me alone to deal with the bank calling every single day. You left me with $8,000 in tax debt. I do not care about ancient history. Little Sister Brandon interrupted loudly, checking his expensive gold wristwatch with an exaggerated sigh. I have a massive corporate development company coming to survey this land on Monday morning. I need this entire place cleared out immediately. So tell your people to start taking down these ridiculous fairy lights and get off my property. Jessica stepped up beside him, slowly removing her oversized sunglasses. She looked around the beautifully decorated barn and let out a short, high-pitched, mocking laugh. Honestly, Abby, she said, her voice dripping with fake condescending pity. Did you really think you could play farmer forever? It is time to let the adults handle the real estate. You should be packing your trash bags right now instead of playing wedding planner for local hicks. The lawyer in the gray suit finally stepped forward, blocking my path to the table. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out another neatly folded document. Miss Hayes, he said, his tone perfectly flat and robotic, I am representing your brother in this legal matter. This document is an official notice to vacate the premises. You are currently trespassing on private property owned solely by Brandon Hayes. If you refuse to halt these commercial operations immediately, I will be forced to contact the county sheriff and have you and your entire staff forcibly removed for illegal occupation. My vision suddenly tunneled. The crisp autumn air in my lungs felt incredibly thin. I looked around wildly at the frantic catering staff, the half-finished floral arrangements, the perfectly aligned oak chairs waiting patiently for a bride and groom who were expecting the happiest day of their entire lives. I had spent 5 agonizing years building this business from the dirt up. I had skipped meals, lost sleep, and sacrificed every single ounce of my personal life to turn a dying, debt-ridden farm into a beautiful sanctuary. I had saved our family legacy with my own 2 hands when no one else cared. And now the older brother who had run away from all the hard work was standing here in his shiny leather loafers, trying to steal the millions of dollars of value I had created. I looked at the legal document sitting heavily on the tablecloth. I looked at the cold, greedy, triumphant smile on my brother's face. He fully expected me to cry. He expected me to break down sobbing in front of my employees and completely surrender. He thought because I was the younger sister, the spare child who always wore his cast-offs, that I would just bow my head, apologize, and walk away into the dirt. But he did not know who I had become. The frightened, overwhelmed girl he left behind 5 years ago was dead and gone. The tough woman standing in front of him had pulled this land back from the brink of absolute ruin. I knew every inch of this soil. I knew the county codes. I knew how to survive, and I knew how to fight. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing the rising panic down into a tight, hard knot in the pit of my stomach. I looked the smug lawyer straight in the eye, and then I turned my intense glare directly onto my brother. I am not shutting anything down, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous, and perfectly steady level. This wedding is happening today. And if you think you can just waltz in here and steal my life's work with a piece of paper, you are severely underestimating me. Brandon let out a loud, theatrical sigh of extreme annoyance. He turned his head to his lawyer. Call the sheriff, he ordered coldly. Let us get these trespassers off my land right now. The lawyer pulled out his phone and began dialing. The catering manager looked at me in sheer wide-eyed panic. The florist started to cry softly into her hands. The nightmare had officially begun and the clock was ticking down to total disaster. The lawyer had his phone pressed to his ear and his thumb hovering over the screen, ready to bring the local sheriff down on my business and destroy my reputation in a single phone call. I did not step back. I stepped directly into his personal space, close enough to smell his expensive cologne. I looked at the sleek silver device in his hand, and then right into his cold, indifferent eyes. Put the phone away, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the courtyard like a whip. The lawyer hesitated, his thumb freezing over the screen. He glanced at Brandon for direction, clearly not used to someone calling his bluff. Brandon simply rolled his eyes and adjusted the cuffs of his pristine navy shirt, acting as if my very existence was a minor inconvenience on his busy Saturday schedule. "You want to talk about property rights?" I continued, pivoting my entire body to face my brother. "Let us talk about property rights, Brandon. Let us talk about this farm that you suddenly care so much about. Let us talk about exactly where you were 5 years ago when Dad passed away." Brandon shifted his weight, his arrogant smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. "Keep your voice down, Abby," he muttered, glancing nervously toward the catering staff who were absolutely paralyzed, hanging on to every single word. "You are making a public spectacle of yourself." "I am making a spectacle," I repeated, letting out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed off the wooden beams of the barn. "You drive a luxury SUV onto a commercial event space, kick over my floral arrangements, and threaten my employees, but I am the one making a spectacle. No, Brandon. We are going to have this conversation right here, right now, out loud." I took another step toward him, forcing him to look down at me. I pointed a dirt-stained finger directly at his chest. 5 years ago, we buried our father. And the very next morning, while I was still trying to figure out how to pay the funeral parlor, the county sent a bright red notice to the house. $8,000. That is what Dad owed in back taxes. $8,000 standing between this family and absolute foreclosure. Jessica sighed loudly, inspecting her manicured fingernails, as if she were profoundly bored by the mention of a measly $8,000. But to me back then, it might as well have been $1 million. I looked back at the lawyer, making sure he heard every single detail of his client's true character. "I brought those tax papers to you, Brandon. I begged you to help me figure out a payment plan. And do you remember what you said to me? Do you remember the exact words that came out of your mouth while you packed your expensive leather duffel bags?" Brandon stared at me, his jaw clenching tightly, but he remained completely silent. "You called this place a worthless, toxic dump," I said, my voice rising with a ferocious, righteous anger I had kept buried for half a decade. "You said this land was a sinking ship, and you were not going to drown with it. You tossed your bags into your car, told me to let the bank have it, and you drove off to Chicago. You completely abandoned your own flesh and blood over $8,000. I swept my arm out, gesturing to the sprawling 50 acres of pristine land surrounding us. The lush emerald green pastures, the massive, beautifully restored 19th century barn holding $40,000 worth of wedding decor. The greenhouse bursting with organic produce. I did this, I practically shouted, tapping my chest forcefully, while you were sitting in some air-conditioned high-rise in Chicago, sipping expensive coffee. I was working 60-hour weeks. I took every single freelance accounting gig I could find in a 50-mile radius. I balanced the books for Bob's Diner on Main Street until 2 a.m. I did payroll for the local auto body shop. I scraped together every single penny, every crumpled dollar bill, and I paid off that tax lien entirely by myself. I stepped so close to my brother I could see the tiny pulse of a vein in his neck. I dug my bare hands into this soil. I spent freezing winters fixing the broken pipes you let rot. I spent blistering summers tearing out dead brush until my hands literally bled. I fought the county agricultural board tooth and nail for 3 straight years to earn our organic certifications. I built the marketing plan. I secured the vendor contracts. I transformed your worthless toxic dump into a premier event venue valued at $1.5 million. I did the work that you were entirely too cowardly to do. The entire courtyard was dead silent. The wind rustled gently through the towering oak trees lining the property, but nobody dared to breathe. The catering manager was staring at me with wide, respectful eyes. My staff knew how hard I worked. They had seen me scrubbing the barn floors at midnight and hauling heavy equipment before the sun came up. They knew the blood and sweat that saturated every wooden plank of this property. I waited for Brandon to show even a singular ounce of shame. I waited for him to look at the incredible empire I had built from the ashes of our father's debt and feel a shred of guilt for abandoning me to face the wolves alone. Instead, a slow, dark, predatory smirk spread across my brother's face. He looked around the beautiful, immaculate wedding setup, nodding his head slowly, as if admiring a newly purchased toy. He looked at the crystal glasses, the blooming flowers, the perfectly manicured lawn. Then he looked back down at me. "Wow," Brandon said, his voice entirely devoid of any human warmth. "I have to admit, Abby, you really did a fantastic job with the place. The organic angle is a very nice touch." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, so only I and the lawyer could hear the sheer cruelty dripping from his next words. "Thanks for doing the free labor for the past 5 years, little sister," he said coldly. "But the management is changing hands today." The absolute audacity of his words hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. Free labor. He actually viewed my 5 years of agonizing, bone-breaking sacrifice as nothing more than a free property management service for his own personal benefit. He had waited in the shadows until the land was profitable, until the risk was entirely gone, and now he was stepping in to claim the crown. Jessica linked her arm through Brandon's, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder. "Do not take it personally, Abby," she chimed in, offering a sickly sweet, entirely artificial smile. "You always were such a hard worker. A real worker bee. But Brandon has a vision for this property that goes way beyond some quaint little country weddings. We are talking major corporate development. You should be proud you kept the grass cut for us." Before I could unleash the absolute torrent of rage boiling in my throat, the lawyer stepped neatly between us. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with the detached clinical efficiency of an executioner. "Miss Hayes," the lawyer said, his voice cutting through the tension with sharp legal precision. "Your personal grievances regarding the physical labor you performed here are entirely irrelevant to the law. My client holds the sole legal deed to this property. You have no legal standing, no ownership stake, and no tenant rights." He tapped a manicured finger against the eviction notice resting on the catering table. "Here is how this is going to work," the lawyer continued smoothly. "You are going to sign this acknowledgement of receipt right now. You will agree to completely vacate these premises by the end of the month. If you agree to leave quietly and without causing any further public scenes, my client will generously allow you to finish hosting today's scheduled event." He paused, letting his eyes flick over toward my terrified catering staff. However, the lawyer added, his tone dropping into a hard, uncompromising threat. "If you refuse to sign, or if you attempt to delay this process in any way, I will call the county sheriff right this second. I will have you officially removed for trespassing. Your staff will be escorted off the property. The gates will be padlocked. And when your wealthy bridal clients arrive, they will find their $40,000 wedding completely canceled by law enforcement. The resulting lawsuits from your clients will bankrupt you for the rest of your natural life." The threat hung in the air, heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly real. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. He had me completely backed into a corner. If I fought them right now, if I demanded the police come and sort this out, the wedding would be destroyed. The bride, a sweet local girl who had trusted me with her life savings, would arrive to find police cruisers blocking her venue. My business reputation, the only thing I truly owned in this world, would be instantly and permanently obliterated. No one would ever book Oak Creek Farm again. Brandon knew exactly what he was doing. He had timed this ambush perfectly. He knew I would never ruin a client's wedding day. He was using my own professional integrity as a weapon against me. I looked at the legal document sitting on the table. The words "notice to vacate" blurred together as hot, angry tears threatened to spill from my eyes. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. I was trapped. Suddenly a loud, joyful honk echoed from the main road. Everyone in the courtyard turned their heads. Turning down the long, winding gravel driveway was a pristine white stretch limousine, followed closely by a parade of shiny black sedans decorated with white ribbons. The bride was here. The family of the bride, the bridesmaids, the photographers. They were all pulling onto the property, expecting a seamless, magical day. Laughter and excited chatter drifted through the open windows of the approaching cars. They had absolutely no idea that a brutal, life-destroying war was happening right next to the catering tent. My chest physically ached with the force of my suppressed panic. I looked at Brandon. He was smiling warmly, watching the limousine approach. He looked like a gracious host preparing to welcome his guests. "Sign the paper," Abby Brandon whispered out of the side of his mouth, his eyes still fixed on the approaching cars. "Or I shut the gates right now. Make your choice." The sheer humiliation washed over me in agonizing waves. I had fought so hard. I had given up my 20s for this soil. And now I was being forced to surrender in front of everyone, stripped of my dignity, my business, and my home. With a shaking hand, I reached out and pulled a pen from my pocket. I did not look at Brandon. I did not look at Jessica. I stared fiercely at the signature line on the document. I quickly scribbled my name, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore right through the thick paper. "Excellent choice," the lawyer said, quietly, smoothly, pulling the document out from under my hand and slipping it safely back into his expensive leather briefcase. "You have 30 days, Miss Hayes. We will be in touch." Brandon adjusted his collar, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "Enjoy the wedding, little sister," he said, with a sickeningly cheerful tone. "Make sure the brisket is not dry. We will be back on Monday to start the land surveys." They turned and walked back to their luxury SUV. I stood there utterly paralyzed, watching them climb into their expensive car. The tires crunched over the gravel as they slowly drove past the arriving bridal party, offering friendly, polite waves to the cars as they passed. The catering manager stepped up beside me, his face pale. "Abby," he asked softly, "what do we do?" I watched the white limousine pull to a stop near the main farmhouse. The doors opened, and a beautiful young woman in a stunning white dress stepped out, her face glowing with absolute pure joy. She saw me standing near the barn and waved excitedly. I forced my facial muscles to arrange themselves into a wide, welcoming smile. I swallowed the thick, burning knot of rage and terror lodged in my throat. "We serve the guests," I told the manager, my voice hollow and distant. "We do our jobs." I walked toward the bride, projecting the calm, confident aura of a professional event coordinator, while inside my entire world was collapsing into dust. I survived that day on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I poured champagne. I directed the photographer. I managed the dinner service. But every time I looked out over the vast, beautiful fields, all I could see was my brother's cruel smirk. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully stolen my life's work. But as the sun finally set over the farm that evening, casting long, dark shadows over the empty fields, the initial shock and terror began to fade away. It was slowly replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute determination. Brandon had a piece of paper, but he had severely underestimated the woman who maintained the ground beneath his feet. I had 30 days, and I was going to use every single second to completely destroy him. The drive back to the farm was a blur. The familiar winding country roads, the towering oak trees, the sprawling green pastures that I usually admired with such intense pride, now looked like a cruel illusion. It was not my land. It had never been my land. I parked my dusty truck near the main farmhouse, turned off the engine, and just sat there in the heavy silence. The remnants of yesterday's beautiful wedding were still scattered across the lawn. The white folding chairs were stacked neatly in rows, waiting for the rental company to pick them up. The empty catering tent flapped gently in the autumn breeze. It was a graveyard of my own success. I walked into the house, moving like a ghost through the quiet rooms. The eviction notice felt like a burning coal inside my pocket. 30 days. I had exactly 30 days to dismantle my entire existence. My mind raced with the terrifying logistical nightmare ahead of me. How do you inform a bride that the venue she booked a year ago is suddenly closing? How do you explain to a tearful family that their money is gone, tied up in permanent structural improvements on a property you do not even own? The sheer panic threatened to suffocate me. I walked into the kitchen and gripped the edge of the counter, forcing myself to take deep, steadying breaths. I needed to start packing. If I was going to lose everything I needed to figure out exactly what I was legally allowed to take with me. I needed to separate my personal property from the farm's assets before Brandon sent his corporate lawyers to claim every single tractor and table as his own. I bypassed the living room and headed straight for the narrow staircase leading up to the dusty, unfinished attic. The attic was a dark, cramped space filled with discarded remnants of my family's history. Broken holiday decorations, old winter coats, and stacks of heavy cardboard boxes containing my father's old records. After Dad passed away, I had shoved all his medical and financial paperwork up here too, overwhelmed by grief and the immediate threat of foreclosure to sort through it properly. I pulled a small chain illuminating a single dim yellow bulb hanging from the wooden rafters. The air up here was thick, smelling faintly of dry rot and old paper. I moved toward a stack of boxes labeled with a thick black marker in my own handwriting. Dad's files. I grabbed the top box, intending to carry it downstairs to the kitchen table where I could sort through it methodically. But as I pulled the box toward my chest, the ancient water-damaged cardboard at the bottom suddenly gave way. The bottom completely blew out. A massive avalanche of paper cascaded violently onto the dusty wooden floorboards. Hundreds of documents, medical bills, insurance claims, and old bank statements spilled everywhere. I let out a loud, frustrated groan and dropped to my knees. It was the perfect metaphor for my entire life right now. Everything I tried to hold together was simply falling apart in my hands. I started gathering the scattered papers indiscriminately, shoving handfuls of them back into the broken box. But as I reached for a thick staple packet of paper near the edge of a wooden beam, a specific date caught my eye. The packet was a comprehensive financial summary from my father's primary checking account dated 6 months before he passed away. It was right around the time his dementia had started to severely impact his daily life. It was also the exact same month the county had issued the original devastating notice of unpaid property taxes. My hands slowed down. My heart performed a strange, heavy stutter in my chest. I sat back on my heels, wiping the dust from my hands onto my jeans, and pulled the bank statement fully into the dim light of the hanging bulb. I remembered the sheer terror I had felt 5 years ago when I discovered the tax debt. I had assumed Dad simply forgot to pay it because his memory was failing. I had assumed the farm was just bleeding money to cover his expensive medical care. I had accepted the debt as an unavoidable tragedy of a failing mind. But as I scanned the itemized list of transactions, a sickening, ice-cold realization began to creep over me. According to the statement, Dad's account had been perfectly healthy at the beginning of that month. He had exactly $9,200 sitting in his emergency savings. That was more than enough to cover the $8,000 tax bill that was due the following week. He had the money. The funds were right there, safely deposited and untouched. I moved my finger down the column of dates tracking the daily balances. And then I saw it. On a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before the property taxes were legally due, there was a massive withdrawal. A wire transfer had completely drained the account. Exactly $8,500 had been removed in a single transaction. I squinted in the dim light, bringing the paper closer to my face. I read the destination routing information printed neatly beside the massive withdrawal. The money had not gone to a hospital. It had not gone to an assisted living facility or a pharmacy. The funds had been wired directly into a private brokerage account, an account registered under the name Brandon Thomas Hayes. My breath hitched in my throat. I dropped the paper onto the floor, my hands suddenly shaking violently. I scrambled forward on my knees, frantically digging through the pile of spilled documents, tearing through the years of history looking for more evidence. I found another envelope, this one containing a copy of a signed wire transfer authorization form provided by the bank. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the form. It was supposed to be my father's signature, but I knew my father's handwriting perfectly. I knew the slow, shaky, uneven letters he produced during those final confusing months of his life. The signature on this authorization form was completely smooth. The loops were perfect. The pressure was even and confident. It was a flawless, identical match to a signature from 10 years ago before the dementia ever took hold. It was a forgery. The terrifying truth settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Brandon had not just abandoned us when things got tough. He had actively, maliciously caused the crisis. He had swooped into town during one of Dad's most vulnerable, confused weeks. He had forged our dying father's signature on a wire transfer document, completely draining his emergency medical fund to pay off his own failing stock market bets in Chicago. Brandon's theft was the sole reason the property taxes were never paid. He had created the $8,000 debt. He had thrown his own father into financial ruin, abandoned the farm to face imminent foreclosure, and ran away, leaving me to blindly clean up the catastrophic mess he had secretly orchestrated. And then 5 years later, he had the absolute audacity to walk onto the property I had saved, smile in my face, and thank me for doing his free labor. The profound, agonizing betrayal was so massive it temporarily stole my ability to breathe. I sat there in the dust, clutching the forged document against my chest, as a wave of intense physical nausea rolled through my stomach. My own brother had engineered my suffering. Every tear I had shed, every freezing night I spent worrying about the bank taking my home, every single sacrifice I made was built on a foundation of his malicious, calculated theft. I closed my eyes, and the image of Brandon smirking at me yesterday flashed brightly in my mind. "Shut it down, Abby. This property is in my name." The sadness inside me instantly vanished. The overwhelming sense of defeat I had felt in Harrison's office completely evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a white-hot, burning fury unlike anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was a pure, absolute rage that demanded absolute destruction. I did not care that he held the deed. I did not care that the law considered me a voluntary tenant. Brandon had drawn first blood 5 years ago, and I was going to finish the war he started. I shoved the bank statements and the forged wire transfer authorization into a heavy manila folder. I grabbed a second box of documents, refusing to leave a single piece of paper unchecked, and carried everything downstairs. I dumped the contents onto the large oak dining table and spent the next 6 hours meticulously combing through every single financial record, legal notice, and county letter my father had ever received. I was looking for a weapon. I was searching for any possible legal flaw, any tiny mistake Brandon might have made while he was busy stealing his inheritance. It was nearly midnight when I found the county zoning map. It was a large folded architectural blueprint issued by the local government 4 years ago, right in the middle of my desperate struggle to save the farm. I remembered the county sending it when they decided to rezone the public highway running past our property. I had almost thrown it away back then, too exhausted by my accounting jobs to care about local civic planning. I spread the large blueprint across the kitchen table, using coffee mugs to hold down the curled corners. I traced my finger along the black lines marking the boundary of Oak Creek Farm. I traced the main county road. And then I traced the tiny, very specific anomaly separating the two. 4 years ago, the county had widened the main road, claiming a large strip of land through eminent domain. In the process, they had legally severed a tiny 2-acre slice of frontage property directly adjacent to the highway from the main 50-acre farm. Because those 2 acres were technically considered an orphaned parcel by the zoning board, and because the property taxes on that specific slice had gone completely unpaid during Dad's illness, the county had put those 2 acres up for a public tax auction. I distinctly remembered sitting in a crowded municipal building on a rainy Tuesday morning, terrified that someone would buy that frontage land and build a gas station right in front of my beautiful wedding venue. I had emptied my meager personal savings account exactly $2,000 and won the bid for those 2 acres. I scrambled to the heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner of my home office, yanking the drawer open so hard it nearly derailed. I pulled out my own personal property file and retrieved the deed to those 2 acres. The name on the heavy embossed document was completely clear: Chloe Abigail Hayes. Not Thomas Hayes, not Brandon Hayes. Just me. I carried the deed back to the kitchen table and laid it gently next to the county zoning blueprint. I stared at the map, analyzing the physical layout of the properties with the clinical, ruthless precision of an accountant looking for a critical error. The main 50-acre farm, the massive property now legally owned entirely by Brandon, sat far back from the public highway. It was a beautiful, sprawling rectangle of highly valuable land. But my tiny 2-acre parcel sat horizontally right across the front. I traced the thick black line representing my property border. My 2 acres completely blocked the main farm from the public road. The long, winding gravel driveway that Brandon had driven his luxury SUV down yesterday was located entirely on my 2 acres. There was absolutely no other physical way to access the 50-acre farm from the public highway without crossing directly over my private land. A slow, dangerous realization began to form in my mind. I grabbed a red marker and circled the driveway. Then I moved my eyes slightly to the right, looking at the topographical symbols printed on the blueprint. I found the small blue circle representing the commercial well. The farm relied on a massive deep water well to irrigate the organic crops and supply the plumbing for the main event barn. I had spent $15,000 upgrading the commercial pump system 3 years ago. I traced the location of the well on the blueprint, matching it to the property lines. The well sat exactly 10 feet inside the border of my 2-acre parcel. I dropped the red marker onto the table. I placed my hands flat against the cold wood, staring at the map, as a terrifying, incredibly beautiful truth washed over me. Because Brandon and I had never spoken over the past 5 years, we had never drafted a legal easement agreement. There was no documented, legally binding contract granting the main 50-acre farm the right to use the driveway on my land. There was no legal contract granting the main farm access to the water from my well. Brandon legally owned the 50-acre farm. He owned the massive, beautiful barn. He owned the green pastures. But without my permission to cross my land, his $2 million farm had no road access. Without my permission to use my well, his $2 million farm had absolutely no water. In the eyes of real estate law, Brandon did not own a highly profitable commercial development site. He owned a completely useless, legally inaccessible piece of dirt. His $2 million inheritance was completely landlocked. It was utterly worthless to him, and it was absolutely worthless to the massive corporate development company he was trying to sell it to. I looked at the forged bank statement sitting next to the blueprint. Brandon thought he had successfully ambushed me. He thought he had trapped me with a 30-day eviction notice, but he had absolutely no idea that he had just aggressively marched right into a devastating, financially lethal trap of his own making. I did not need 30 days to pack. I needed exactly 14 days to let my brother climb to the very peak of his own arrogance, to let him sign corporate contracts and spend money he did not actually have before I completely kicked the ladder out from under him. The war was no longer about saving my business. It was about absolute, undeniable justice. Tuesday morning brought a strange, heavy chill to the air, the kind that settles deep into your bones and warns you of an approaching storm. I was out in the southern field before the sun fully cleared the tree line, kneeling in the rich, dark soil of my greenhouse. My hands were coated in damp earth as I carefully pruned the leaves of my prized heirloom tomato plants. These were not just any crops. They were Cherokee purples and brandywines that I had cultivated from seeds nurtured through unseasonal frosts and promised to 3 different high-end restaurants in the county. They represented months of my meticulous labor. The peaceful quiet of the morning was shattered by the aggressive rumbling roar of heavy diesel engines. I stood up, wiping my soiled hands on my denim apron, and stepped out of the greenhouse. My heart plummeted into my stomach. Rolling down my long gravel driveway was a convoy of 3 massive white pickup trucks. Stenciled on the side of each door in bold, aggressive blue lettering was the logo for Horizon Developments. They did not stop at the visitor parking area. They drove their heavy tires straight off the gravel and directly onto the manicured green lawn I had spent 4 years perfecting for wedding ceremonies. Before I could even shout for them to stop, the doors flew open. A dozen men in bright orange hard hats and reflective safety vests poured out of the vehicles. They carried massive tripods, laser measuring tools, and thick bundles of neon pink wooden stakes. They moved with the chaotic, practiced efficiency of a demolition crew that had absolutely no respect for the land they were standing on. And leading the charge, stepping delicately out of the passenger side of the lead truck, was Jessica. She looked utterly absurd standing in the middle of a working agricultural property. She wore pristine white designer trousers, a tailored silk blouse, and towering wedge sandals that immediately began to sink into the soft, dewy grass. She held a large iced coffee in one hand and pointed across my fields with the other, directing the work crew like a general commanding an invasion. "Hey," I screamed, sprinting across the lawn as fast as my work boots would allow. "Stop right there. Get those trucks off the grass." The surveyors completely ignored me. Two of them had already marched directly into my southern crop field. I watched in absolute paralyzing horror as one of the men lifted a heavy metal mallet and violently drove a thick wooden stake right through the center of my healthiest heirloom tomato vine. The thick green stalk snapped with a sickening crunch. Bright red, perfectly ripe tomatoes were crushed instantly beneath his heavy steel-toed boots. He tied a strip of neon pink plastic tape to the top of the stake, marking the spot of his destruction, and moved on to the next row. I lunged forward to grab the surveyor by the shoulder, but a perfectly manicured hand shot out and blocked my path. "Do not touch my contractors, Abby," Jessica said, her voice sharp and ringing with venomous authority. I whipped around to face my sister-in-law. My chest was heaving with exertion and fury. "Jessica, what in the world do you think you are doing? You are destroying thousands of dollars worth of organic produce. Tell these men to get off my property this instant." Jessica took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced coffee. She looked at me from head to toe, her eyes lingering mockingly on the mud-stained knees of my jeans and the dirt packed under my fingernails. "Your property," she repeated, laughing, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed across the field. "I think you mean Brandon's property. And as the legal owner, Brandon has officially authorized Horizon Developments to begin conducting full topographic surveys of the land. We are on a very tight schedule, Abby. We do not have time to worry about your little vegetable garden." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the sheer breathtaking cruelty of her actions. "You could have waited until the end of the month," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You have an eviction notice in place. I have until the 30th. You did not have to come here today and crush my crops." Jessica smiled, but her eyes were utterly dead. "We did not have to," she agreed smoothly. "But the corporate buyers wanted to get a head start on the zoning permits. And quite frankly, Brandon and I are tired of waiting for you to pack up your trash." She stepped closer, invading my personal space. The cloying, overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume completely masked the natural, earthy smell of the farm. "Let me explain the real world to you, Abby," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. "Horizon Developments is not buying this place to play in the mud. They are paying us $2 million in cash. $2 million. Do you even know what that kind of money looks like? Because I know you have never seen it balancing checkbooks for small-town diners." She gestured widely with her coffee cup toward the massive historic wooden barn I had painstakingly restored by hand. "They are going to bulldoze that rotting old barn on day one," she boasted proudly. "They are going to pave over these ridiculous pastures, tear down the greenhouse, and build a luxury suburban subdivision. 120 identical high-end homes with 3-car garages and a community clubhouse. It is going to be gorgeous. And Brandon and I are going to take our $2 million and never look back at this depressing, miserable town ever again." Every single word she spoke was designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She was not just telling me about a real estate transaction. She was violently dismantling my entire identity. She was gleefully describing the execution of my life's work. I had poured my absolute soul into preserving the natural beauty of Oak Creek Farm, fighting to keep the local ecosystem alive, creating a sanctuary where people could escape the concrete of the city. And she was standing here bragging about smothering it all in asphalt, just so she could buy more designer clothes. "We are closing on a penthouse in downtown Chicago next week." Jessica continued, her eyes alight with pure, unfiltered greed. "It has floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. It has a private elevator. It is the kind of life Brandon always deserved, the kind of life he was meant for before your father tried to chain him to this miserable dirt patch." I clenched my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. "You are a truly disgusting person, Jessica," I said quietly. "You and Brandon both. You stole this farm from a dying man." Jessica did not even flinch. She just threw her head back and laughed.
"Oh, grow up, Abby,"
she sneered. "The world belongs to people who are smart enough to take what they want. You spent the best years of your youth playing the loyal, obedient martyr. You thought working hard and getting dirt under your fingernails made you a better person than us. But look at you now." She pointed a long acrylic fingernail directly at my chest. "You are 29 years old, totally broke, completely alone, and about to be homeless. You are nothing but a glorified peasant Abby. And next week, you will not even have a farm to pretend you are important on. So why do you not do us all a favor, go into that little farmhouse and start putting your cheap clothes into cardboard boxes?" She turned her back on me, signaling to the lead surveyor to continue driving their neon stakes through the very heart of my livelihood. I stood frozen in this field, watching the destruction unfold around me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to physically tear the stakes out of the ground. But the terrifying, suffocating reality of my situation chained my feet to the earth. Harrison Cole. My attorney had been explicitly clear. I had no legal ownership rights. If I interfered with the surveyors, if I touched their equipment or caused a scene, Brandon's lawyer would immediately file trespassing and destruction of property charges against me. They would have me arrested, thrown in the county jail, and forcibly evicted before the sun went down. I was completely trapped in a legal cage, forced to watch my own execution. I turned away from the field and walked back toward the main farmhouse, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears. But the psychological warfare was far from over. When I reached the front porch, I looked toward the edge of the property line near the county highway. A low, terrifying rumbling sound vibrated through the wooden planks beneath my feet. I looked up and saw 3 massive, bright yellow Caterpillar bulldozers slowly pulling off the asphalt and parking on the dirt shoulder just outside my main gate. They did not turn their engines off. They just sat there idling loudly, their massive steel blades resting inches from the ground. They looked like giant metallic vultures patiently circling a dying animal, waiting for the exact moment I packed my bags so they could roll in and tear my world to shreds. I stumbled into the farmhouse and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me, leaning my back against the wood and sliding down to the floor. The sound of the bulldozers rattled the window panes. Then the telephone in my home office began to ring. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the mechanical noise outside. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, forced myself to stand up, and walked over to the desk. I looked at the caller identification screen. It was the mother of a bride whose wedding was scheduled for the first weekend of November, less than 2 months away. I picked up the receiver. "Hello, this is Oak Creek Farm," I said desperately, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "Abby," the woman said, her voice frantic and breathless. "I am so sorry to call you so early, but my husband just drove past the farm on his way to work in the city. He said there are bulldozers parked outside the gates. He said there are men in hard hats tearing up the fields. Abby, what is going on? Please tell me our venue is safe. Please tell me my daughter's wedding is not canceled." My stomach plummeted into an endless dark abyss. The corporate surveyors were not just destroying my crops. They were actively destroying my reputation in real time in a small town where rumors spread faster than a wildfire. "Mom, I promise you everything is fine," I lied, my voice cracking slightly. "We are just having some routine land surveying done by the county. It has absolutely nothing to do with the event spaces." "Are you sure?" she pressed, sounding completely unconvinced. "Because my husband said he saw a woman out there telling a delivery driver that the property was sold to a residential developer. Abby, we paid you a $10,000 non-refundable deposit. If this venue is closing, we need our money back today. We cannot afford to lose that money. We will have to sue you." I closed my eyes, pressing the bridge of my nose tightly between my fingers. "I will not let your daughter down," I promised, my voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I will call you back this afternoon with a full update. Please just give me a few hours." I hung up the phone before she could demand anything else. But the moment the receiver hit the cradle, the phone immediately began to ring again. It was another bride. And then an email notification pinged loudly on my computer screen. Then another and another. The panic was spreading. Horizon Developments had deliberately brought heavy machinery and corporate surveyors to my property during regular business hours to make a highly visible, incredibly aggressive public statement. They wanted everyone in the county to know the farm was dead. They wanted to crush my business operations so thoroughly that I would simply surrender and leave before the 30-day eviction notice expired. I sat down heavily into my office chair, staring blankly at the glowing computer screen. The inbox was filling up with terrified messages from clients demanding refunds. The problem was, I did not have their money sitting in a liquid cash account. I ran a working agricultural farm. The deposit money from those upcoming weddings had already been entirely reinvested into the property. It had paid for the organic seeds that Jessica's men were currently stomping into the mud. It had paid for the new roof on the barn. It had paid for the property taxes that kept the county from foreclosing. If I was forced to cancel those weddings, I would not just be homeless. I would owe my clients over $60,000 in refunded deposits. When I failed to pay them, they would rightfully sue me. The court would garnish my wages for the rest of my life. Brandon was not just taking my inheritance. He was ensuring I would be permanently, irreparably ruined. I looked out the office window. Jessica was laughing loudly at something one of the surveyors said. The bulldozers continued their menacing idle rumble at the edge of the property. The neon pink stakes multiplied across the green fields like a terrible spreading disease. I was completely cornered. I had no money, no legal claim to the land, and my business was collapsing in real time. My entire life had been meticulously stripped away layer by layer until I had absolutely nothing left to defend myself with. I buried my face in my hands, listening to the relentless ringing of the telephone, and felt the dark, crushing weight of total defeat pressing down on my chest. I had lost. Brandon had won. I was a peasant, and the corporate machine was going to pave over my dreams. But as I sat there in the quiet misery of my office, surrounded by the shadows of my father's old belongings, a tiny, deeply buried spark of defiance refused to completely extinguish. I was backed into a corner, but cornered animals are the most dangerous. I needed to fight back, but I could not do it on the battlefield Brandon had chosen. I needed to dig deeper. I needed to find a weapon he never saw coming. The heavy rumble of the corporate bulldozers finally ceased as the sun dipped below the western tree line, leaving behind a suffocating, oppressive silence. The house that had sheltered my family for 3 generations felt like a tomb. I was utterly exhausted, completely drained of tears, and cornered by a legal system that favored the wealthy and the deceitful. Harrison Cole had warned me that fighting the eviction without an ownership stake was a losing battle. The brutal reality was staring me right in the face. I had to start packing my life into cardboard boxes. I walked through the quiet kitchen, my boots heavy on the scuffed linoleum, and pulled down the creaky wooden stairs leading to the attic. The air up there was stagnant, smelling of dry rot, old pine, and decades of forgotten memories. Dust motes danced aggressively in the beam of my flashlight as I navigated the cramped space. Tucked away in the furthest corner beneath a moth-eaten quilt sat a stack of heavy banker's boxes. I had shoved them up here 5 years ago, right after we buried our father. They contained his medical records, old tax returns, and decades of financial history. Back then, I was too overwhelmed by grief and the terrifying threat of the bank taking the farm to properly sort through his paperwork. I had simply taped them shut and pushed them out of sight. I grabbed the handles of the top box, intending to drag it toward the attic stairs, so I could sift through the contents in the kitchen. But the cardboard had absorbed years of seasonal humidity. As I yanked the heavy load against my chest, the moisture-weakened bottom completely gave way. The box ruptured with a loud tearing sound. An absolute avalanche of yellowed paper, thick manila envelopes, and rubber-banded receipts cascaded over my boots and scattered violently across the rough wooden floorboards. I dropped to my knees, letting out a frustrated, guttural groan. It felt like a cruel joke from the universe, a physical manifestation of my entire life falling apart in my hands. I sat in the dim light, surrounded by the physical debris of my father's existence, and began wildly shoving handfuls of documents back into the broken box. My hands were moving frantically, driven by pure anxious energy, until my fingers brushed against a thick, stapled packet of bank statements. The stark blue logo of the local community bank caught my eye. I stopped. I pulled the packet into the direct beam of my flashlight and looked at the printed date. It was a comprehensive financial summary from my father's primary checking account, dated exactly 6 months before he passed away. This was the exact same period when his dementia had begun to severely ravage his mind. It was the season he started forgetting to turn off the stove, the season he stopped recognizing the mail carrier. It was also the exact same month the county had issued the original devastating notice of unpaid property taxes. The very debt that had pushed this farm to the absolute brink of foreclosure. The debt that Brandon had used as an excuse to call this place a worthless, toxic dump before running away to Chicago. My breathing slowed down. The sharp analytical instincts of my accounting background instantly overrode my panic. I smoothed the wrinkled paper flat against the floorboards and began to read the itemized ledger. I had always assumed that the tax default happened because my father simply forgot to pay the bill, or because his expensive medical care had quietly bled his accounts dry. I had accepted the $8,000 debt as the tragic, unavoidable consequence of a failing mind. But as I scanned the daily balances, a cold, sickening realization began to crawl up my spine. According to the official bank ledger, my father's account had been perfectly healthy at the beginning of that month. He had exactly $9,200 sitting securely in an emergency medical fund. That was more than enough to cover the $8,000 tax bill that was legally due just 2 weeks later. He had the money. The funds were right there, safely deposited and completely untouched. I ran my dirt-stained index finger down the column of dates tracking the daily transactions. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A grocery run here, a pharmacy charge there, and then my finger stopped dead. On a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before the property taxes were legally due to the county, there was a massive, catastrophic withdrawal. A wire transfer had completely gutted the account. Exactly $8,500 had been removed in a single devastating transaction. The remaining balance was left at a pitiful $700, guaranteeing the upcoming tax check would bounce. I brought the paper inches from my face, squinting fiercely in the poor lighting. I read the destination routing information printed in tiny blocky text beside the withdrawal amount. The money had not gone to a hospital. It had not gone to an assisted living facility, a specialist, or an insurance company. The funds had been wired directly into a private wealth management brokerage account, an account registered under the name Brandon Thomas Hayes. My heart stopped beating for one long, terrifying second. I dropped the statement onto the floor, my hands suddenly trembling so violently I could barely control them. I scrambled forward on my knees, tearing through the pile of spilled documents like a desperate animal, throwing aside old utility bills and vehicle registrations. I was searching for the physical authorization form, the paper trail that the bank would have absolutely required to execute a wire transfer of that magnitude. Near a rusted nail protruding from a floorboard, I found a sealed envelope from the bank containing transaction receipts. I ripped it open, tearing the paper in my haste. Inside was a carbon copy of the official wire transfer authorization form. I stared at the signature line at the very bottom of the page. It was supposed to be my father's signature, Thomas Arthur Hayes. But I knew my father's handwriting. I knew exactly what it looked like during those final agonizing months of his life. His motor skills had deteriorated drastically. His handwriting had devolved into a slow, shaky, uneven scrawl that barely stayed on the designated line. I had watched him struggle for 5 minutes just to sign a birthday card. The signature on this bank authorization form was completely flawless. The loops of the letters were smooth and confident. The pen pressure was perfectly even. It was a precise, practiced, identical match to a signature from a decade ago, long before the dementia had ever taken hold of his brain. It was a blatant, undeniable forgery. The suffocating truth crashed over me with the force of a freight train. Brandon had not just been a cowardly son who abandoned his family when things got difficult. He had actively, maliciously engineered the entire financial crisis. He had swooped into town during one of my father's most vulnerable, disoriented weeks. He had taken advantage of a dying man whose mind was slipping away. He had forged our father's signature on a legal banking document, completely draining the emergency medical fund. But why? Why would Brandon, who always boasted about his lucrative consulting gigs and flashy lifestyle, need to steal $8,000 from a sick old man? I dug back into the pile, my mind working at lightning speed. I found another set of folded papers tucked inside a generic white envelope. They were heavily redacted statements from Brandon's Chicago brokerage firm, accidentally mailed to the farm address years ago and tossed into this box. I scanned the trade histories and margin requirements. There it was. The motive was spelled out in black and white accounting terms. Brandon had been trading heavily on margin, borrowing money from his broker to make risky, highly leveraged stock bets. The market had taken a sudden violent dip that month. His broker had issued a margin call demanding an immediate cash deposit to cover the massive losses in his portfolio. If Brandon did not deposit the funds within 48 hours, his broker would have liquidated his remaining assets and ruined his credit entirely. He needed cash immediately. He could not get a traditional loan fast enough. So he drove down to the farm, sat at the kitchen table with a man who could barely remember what year it was, and committed elder financial abuse to save his own skin. Brandon's theft was the sole singular reason the property taxes were never paid. He had deliberately created the $8,000 debt that pushed our family to the brink of absolute ruin. He had thrown his own father under the bus, abandoned the farm to face imminent foreclosure, and ran away to Chicago with clean hands. He left me his younger sister to blindly clean up the catastrophic mess he had secretly orchestrated. For 5 years, I had carried the crushing weight of that debt. I had sacrificed my youth, my social life, and my mental health, working myself to the bone to save a farm I thought had failed naturally. Every tear I had shed, every freezing winter night I spent worrying about the bank taking my home, every single blister on my hands was built on a foundation of his malicious, calculated theft. And then, 5 years later, he had the absolute audacity to walk onto the property I had saved, kick over my flower smile in my face, and thank me for doing his free labor. The profound, agonizing betrayal was so massive it temporarily paralyzed me. I sat there in the dust, clutching the forged document against my chest, as a wave of intense physical nausea rolled through my stomach. I thought about Jessica standing in my field, bragging about their new Chicago penthouse and calling me a glorified peasant. I thought about the sleek corporate lawyer threatening to call the sheriff on me. They thought they were so incredibly smart. They thought they had legally outmaneuvered a simple country girl who was too stupid to understand real estate law. I closed my eyes. The image of Brandon smirking at me under the catering tent flashed brightly in my mind. Shut it down, Abby. This property is in my name. The overwhelming sadness and despair that had suffocated me all day instantly vanished. The helpless, panicked feeling of being a victim completely evaporated from my bloodstream. It was entirely replaced by a white-hot, burning fury unlike anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was not a chaotic, screaming kind of anger. It was a pure, cold, absolute rage that demanded total and utter destruction. I did not care that he held the deed right now. I did not care that the law currently considered me a voluntary tenant. Brandon had drawn first blood 5 years ago when he robbed our dying father, and I was going to finish the war he started. He wanted to play legal games and use the justice system as a weapon against me. I was going to show him exactly how lethal an angry accountant with a paper trail could be. I carefully gathered the bank statements, the forged wire transfer authorization, and the margin call records. I smoothed out every single crease and placed them gently into a heavy manila folder. I was no longer packing to leave. I was organizing my ammunition. I grabbed the flashlight and began meticulously tearing through the rest of the boxes, refusing to leave a single piece of paper unchecked. I was searching for any other legal flaw, any tiny mistake Brandon might have made while he was busy stealing his inheritance. He thought he had successfully ambushed me. He thought he had trapped me with a 30-day eviction notice. But he had absolutely no idea that he had just aggressively marched right back onto a battlefield where I held all the buried secrets. I carried the heavy manila folder downstairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my boots. I walked into the kitchen and threw the documents onto the large oak dining table. I turned on every light in the room. The exhaustion was completely gone. My mind was razor sharp. I was going to audit my brother's entire life, and I was going to make sure he paid for every single thing he had stolen with absolute crushing interest. The adrenaline that had fueled my frantic midnight search through the attic slowly faded into a cold and heavy dread. By the time the sun came up, I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the manila folder containing the absolute proof of my brother's devastating theft. The forged bank statements and the unauthorized wire transfer documents were a smoking gun. Brandon had maliciously robbed our dying father of $8,000 to cover his own risky stock market debts, triggering the tax default that almost destroyed our family. It was a vile and calculated betrayal. But as the morning light crept across the wooden floorboards, my analytical accounting brain took over, replacing my initial wave of righteous vindication with a terrifying reality check. Proving a 5-year-old forgery in a court of law is a painfully slow and highly complex process. You have to hire handwriting experts. You have to file police reports. You have to navigate the notoriously sluggish bureaucracy of the criminal justice system. Meanwhile, the corporate real estate machine moves at lightning speed. Horizon Developments was scheduled to close on the farm property in exactly 14 days. By the time a judge even looked at my forgery evidence, my historic barn would be reduced to splinters, and my beautiful heirloom crops would be buried under thick layers of black asphalt. Brandon would have his $2 million in cash, and he would easily use a fraction of it to hire expensive defense attorneys to delay the forgery trial for years. I needed something faster. I needed a weapon that could stop a massive fleet of corporate bulldozers right this very second. I grabbed the manila folder, threw on a clean shirt, and drove straight into town. Harrison Cole occupied a law office in a converted brick bank building just off the main town square. I did not bother making an appointment. I burst through the heavy glass doors just as his receptionist was turning on the coffee maker. I paced the floor of the waiting area until Harrison finally arrived and called me into his wood-paneled office. I sat down in the leather guest chair and slid the manila folder across his massive mahogany desk. I watched his face closely as he pulled out the bank statements and the forged wire transfer authorization. Harrison was a seasoned professional who had practiced real estate and estate law for 3 decades. He had seen every ugly family dispute imaginable. But as he read through the financial documents, his jaw tightened and the color slowly drained from his weathered face. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound sympathy and deep professional concern. "Abby," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. "This is absolutely terrible. It is a clear-cut case of elder financial abuse and fraud. But I have to be completely honest with you. This will not stop the corporate sale next week. Horizon Developments is a bona fide purchaser with absolutely no knowledge of this underlying family fraud. We can certainly sue your brother for the stolen funds, but we cannot legally halt the immediate transfer of the deed without a formal court injunction. And no judge in this county will grant an emergency injunction blocking a $2 million sale based solely on a 5-year-old bank statement without a full evidentiary hearing." My heart sank straight into my stomach. The victory I had felt at midnight completely evaporated. I was right back in the corner, suffocating under the weight of my brother's calculated greed and the relentless speed of corporate lawyers. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed his temples thoughtfully. "We need a structural defect," he muttered, almost talking to himself. "We need a massive title issue, an environmental hazard, or a strict boundary dispute that makes the land instantly uninsurable for a major corporate developer." He swiveled his chair around and opened a wide, flat drawer behind his desk. He pulled out a massive rolled-up architectural blueprint of the local county zoning map. He spread the heavy, oversized paper across his desk, using 2 thick law books to hold down the curled edges. "Let us look at the geographical layout one more time," he said, pulling a silver pen from his shirt pocket. He traced the bold black lines that defined the 50 acres of Oak Creek Farm. I stood up and leaned over the desk, my eyes following his pen as he outlined the northern pasture, the southern crop fields, and the dense cluster of oak trees near the eastern boundary. Then his pen stopped at the very front of the property, right where the farm met the public state highway. Harrison frowned, leaning closer to the blueprint. "The property lines right here are incredibly strange," he noted, tapping the silver pen against a small horizontal rectangle that was clearly separated from the main 50-acre block. I looked down at the specific area he was indicating. A sudden electric shock of memory rushed through my brain, making the hairs on my arms stand up. 4 years ago, I said my voice barely above a whisper. The county widened the state highway to accommodate heavier commercial traffic. Harrison nodded slowly, his eyes still firmly fixed on the intricate map. "That is right. They used eminent domain to claim a 50-foot strip along the entire road. But what exactly happened to this remaining sliver of land right behind the new shoulder?" I took a deep, shaky breath, the pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle rapidly snapping together in my mind. When the county carved out the new highway shoulder, I explained it orphaned a tiny 2-acre slice of our frontage property. Because it was physically separated from the main agricultural block by a small municipal drainage ditch, the county zoning board officially reclassified it as a separate commercial parcel. And because my father was deep in the grips of his severe dementia at the time, all the obscure tax notices regarding that specific newly created parcel went completely ignored. The county eventually put those 2 orphaned acres up for a public tax auction. Harrison looked up at me, his eyes widening with sudden intense interest. "Who bought it?" he asked softly. I swallowed hard, remembering the sheer overwhelming panic I had felt back then. I remembered sitting in a damp, crowded municipal building on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was absolutely terrified that some out-of-town developer would buy that tiny slice of land and construct a bright, ugly gas station or a massive flashing billboard right in front of my beautiful rustic wedding venue. It would have completely ruined the peaceful, secluded atmosphere I was trying so desperately to build for my clients. So I took every single penny I had managed to save from my freelance accounting jobs. Exactly $2,500. I went to the tax auction and I placed the winning bid. "I bought the land, Harrison," I said, my voice growing stronger and more certain with every syllable. "I bought those 2 acres with my own personal funds. The deed is completely separated from my father's estate. The deed is exclusively in the name of Abby Hayes." Harrison dropped his silver pen onto the blueprint with a sharp, echoing clatter. He stared at the map for a long, heavy moment, a slow, predatory smile beginning to form on his seasoned face. He looked at the main 50-acre farm legally owned by my arrogant brother. Then he looked at the tiny 2-acre horizontal strip owned entirely by me. "Abby?" He said, his voice trembling slightly with an excitement I had never heard from him before. "Tell me exactly what physical structures are located on your 2 acres of land." I leaned over the desk, my heart pounding a frantic, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I placed my index finger firmly on the map, tracing a path from the public highway straight across the 2-acre rectangle and into the main farm. "The driveway," I said, a massive wave of relief washing over me. "The long, winding gravel driveway that serves as the sole point of entry for the entire property. The exact driveway that Brandon parked his luxury car on yesterday. The driveway that Horizon Developments needs to access the site. It is located entirely on my personal land." Harrison let out a short, breathless laugh. "Is there any other way to access the 50 acres from a public road?" he asked quickly, his eyes darting across the blueprints. I shook my head immediately. "Absolutely not. The eastern boundary is bordered by a steep, unnavigable ravine. The western boundary backs up against a protected state forest. The southern boundary is blocked by a neighboring commercial cattle ranch. The only physical way in or out of Oak Creek Farm is through the front gate straight across my 2 acres. Harrison clapped his hands together, the loud sound startling me in the quiet office. "Okay," he said, his eyes practically gleaming with legal anticipation. "That is incredibly good. But what else? A 2-acre parcel usually contains more than just a strip of gravel. Think very carefully, Abby. I looked back down at the blueprint, my eyes scanning the tiny topographical markings printed by the county surveyors. I found the small, faded blue circle printed near the edge of the property line. The well, I whispered, feeling a sudden breathtaking rush of absolute euphoria flood my entire system. The massive deep-water commercial well. I spent $15,000 of my venue profits upgrading the pump system 3 years ago to ensure we had enough water pressure to sustain the greenhouse and the main event barn. The well supplies every single drop of water for the entire 50-acre operation. I pointed a shaking finger to the tiny blue circle on the map. It sits exactly 10 feet inside the border of my 2-acre parcel. Harrison leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together and resting them against his chin. He looked like a master chess player who had just realized his deeply arrogant opponent had unknowingly walked directly into a devastating checkmate. "Abby?" he said, his tone turning incredibly serious but laced with profound, undeniable satisfaction. "Listen to me very carefully. When you purchased those 2 acres at the county tax auction, did you ever sit down with your father or later with your brother and draft a formal, legally binding easement agreement? Did you ever sign a piece of paper granting the main farm the permanent legal right to cross your property or draw water from your private well?" I shook my head without a single second of hesitation. "Never," I replied firmly. My father was entirely too sick to understand complex legal documents by the time I bought the land. And Brandon completely abandoned us. He never answered my calls. He ignored my emails. We have not spoken a single word to each other in 5 long years. There was never any logical reason to draft an easement because I was running the whole operation as one continuous farm. I was the only person managing the land. Harrison let out a loud, triumphant laugh that filled the small office. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the sleepy town square with a massive grin on his face. "Do you understand what this means, Abby?" he asked, turning back to face me. "Do you understand the absolute magnitude of the legal weapon you just discovered?" I stood frozen, letting the brilliant reality of his words sink deep into my mind. "Your brother legally owns 50 acres of prime agricultural land," Harrison explained, his voice ringing with authority. "He owns the beautiful restored barn. He owns the green pastures. He owns the expensive greenhouse structure. But in the eyes of real estate law, his massive $2 million inheritance is completely landlocked. Landlocked." The word felt like a heavy, solid iron vault locking shut around my brother's greedy ambitions. I looked down at the map, seeing the undeniable reality of the geographic layout. Brandon's massive property was completely surrounded by impenetrable natural barriers on 3 sides and by my private, unyielding property on the 4th. Without my explicit, legally documented permission to cross my land, his property had absolutely 0 road access. Without my permission to access my commercial pump, his magnificent farm had absolutely 0 water. I felt a wild, exhilarating rush of pure adrenaline. Brandon had marched onto my farm like a conquering king. He had brought a slick corporate lawyer to threaten me with police action. He had let his status-obsessed wife mock my clothes and call me a peasant. They fully believed they had brilliantly outsmarted me. They thought they had secured a massive, effortless payday built entirely on my 5 years of grueling, agonizing sacrifice. But they were wrong. They were so incredibly, devastatingly wrong. Horizon Developments is not buying a quaint little farm, Harrison continued, tapping the blueprint for emphasis. They are buying raw land to build a massive luxury suburban subdivision. A luxury subdivision requires paved access roads. It requires massive, highly reliable municipal water connections. No county planning board in the entire country will issue a single zoning permit or building authorization for a residential development on a landlocked parcel with no legal water rights. Horizon's corporate attorneys will inevitably uncover this massive title defect during their final survey review right before closing. The property is completely useless to them. I stared at the blueprint, my mind working brilliantly, connecting every single dot of my upcoming strategy. Brandon is completely desperate for this cash, I said softly. the plan forming perfectly in my head. He needs this multi-million-dollar sale to fund the extravagant, wealthy lifestyle he and Jessica are already pretending to live. He is arrogant. He never bothers to read the fine print because he thinks he is so much smarter than everyone else in the room. He blindly assumes this farm is one continuous, unproblematic block of land because he never stayed around long enough to actually manage it or understand the local zoning laws. Harrison nodded in total agreement. "So what is our move?" he asked. "Do we send his lawyer a cease and desist letter today? Do we file an injunction and block the corporate sale right now?" I thought about the forged bank statements sitting in the manila folder. I thought about the crushed heirloom tomatoes in my field and the terrifying, heartbroken phone calls from my panicked brides. I thought about the sheer suffocating terror my father must have felt during his moments of lucidity, knowing his savings were gone and his farm was failing. "If we warn him right now," I said, my voice turning as cold and hard as steel, "he will simply delay the corporate sale. He will hire expensive lawyers to try and force an easement through the local courts. He will tie me up in exhausting litigation for years. I am not going to give him a single chance to prepare a legal defense." I looked at Harrison, my plan solidifying into a perfect, inescapable trap. "We let him think he has completely won," I said. "We let him sign the binding corporate contracts with Horizon Developments. We let him demand his massive non-refundable earnest money deposits. We let him spend money he does not actually have. We wait until the very last possible second when he has fully committed himself to a lavish lifestyle he cannot afford, and then we completely pull the ground out from under him." Harrison leaned back against his desk, a look of profound, genuine respect crossing his face. "We are not just going to stop the sale, Abby," he said quietly. "No," I replied, picking up the manila folder containing the proof of his forgery. "We are going to let him utterly destroy himself." I left the law office that morning feeling taller, stronger, and completely fearless. The brutal countdown had officially begun, and my brother had no idea that he was walking straight into a legal minefield. The following morning felt entirely different from the day before. The suffocating weight of impending homelessness had vanished, completely replaced by a cold and calculating clarity. I sat at my heavy oak kitchen table, watching the early sunlight spill across the forged bank statements and the county zoning map. I had the ultimate weapon resting right under my fingertips. I had the legal power to utterly destroy the man who had robbed our dying father and tried to steal my life's work. But having a weapon and knowing exactly when to use it are two very different things. Harrison Cole had been incredibly strict with his instructions before I left his law office. He warned me that if Brandon caught even a single whiff of my discovery, he would immediately slam the brakes on the corporate sale. He would hire aggressive defense attorneys to drag me into a brutal, years-long legal battle over property access rights. He would use his superior financial resources to bleed me completely dry in court until I could no longer afford to fight. To secure an absolute victory, I had to play the long game. I had to let my brother feel completely invincible. I had to convince him that he had broken my spirit so thoroughly that I was no longer a threat. I had to play the loser. It was perhaps the most difficult psychological test I have ever faced. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, staring at the telephone mounted on the kitchen wall. I needed to call the man who had engineered my family's financial ruin and beg him for mercy. I closed my eyes and mentally gathered every ounce of grief, exhaustion, and betrayal I had felt over the past 5 years. I let the memories of my father's confused, terrified face wash over me. I let the sting of Jessica's cruel insults echo in my ears. When I felt a genuine burning lump of emotion rise in my throat, I picked up the receiver and dialed Brandon's number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. He did not say hello. "You have 30 days. Abby," Brandon said, his voice dripping with bored irritation. "My lawyer made that incredibly clear. There is absolutely nothing to discuss." "Brandon, please," I said, forcing my voice to tremble. I pitched my tone perfectly, letting it crack with just the right amount of desperation and defeat. I squeezed my eyes shut, channeling all my genuine hatred into a convincing display of pure sorrow. "I am not calling to fight the eviction. I know you won. I know I have no legal rights to the farm. There was a brief, satisfying pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear his chest puffing out with overwhelming pride. The great, successful older brother had finally forced the stubborn peasant sister into total submission. "Then why are you calling me?" he asked, his tone softening from irritation into a sickeningly sweet condescension. "I just need a little more time," I pleaded, letting a single very real sob slip past my lips. "I cannot pack up a 50-acre agricultural operation in 4 weeks. I have massive industrial tractors that need to be transported. I have a commercial greenhouse full of sensitive irrigation equipment that I need to dismantle and sell just to afford a tiny apartment in town. I have to contact dozens of furious brides and beg them not to sue me for canceling their weddings. Please, Brandon, I am begging you, just give me 14 extra days. Give me until the middle of next month to get my things off your property." I heard a muffled sound in the background. It was Jessica whispering something in a mocking sing-song voice. Brandon chuckled softly, a sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. He was thoroughly enjoying my humiliation. He was bathing in the glorious sound of my completely fabricated despair. "You really should have planned your life better, little sister," Brandon lectured smoothly, adopting the tone of a wise mentor offering financial advice to a foolish child. "You spent 5 years playing in the mud instead of building a real career. Now you are paying the price." The adult world does not hand out extensions just because you are crying. I know, I whimpered, gripping the telephone cord so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I was wrong. You and Jessica were right about everything. I am just asking for 2 weeks. I will leave the farmhouse spotless. I will not cause any trouble with the corporate surveyors. I just need a few more days to gather my heavy machinery so I do not walk away completely empty-handed. Please, do not completely destroy me." Brandon let out a long theatrical sigh, relishing his position as the supreme judge of my fate. He thought he held my entire future in the palm of his hand. He believed my complete surrender meant the land was entirely secure, that no legal hurdles or family disputes would interfere with his massive payday. "Fine," Brandon said generously. "You have until the 15th of next month. But let me be perfectly clear, Abby. If there is so much as a single broken tractor or a leftover trash bag sitting on my grass on the 16th, I will have the county sheriff drag you off the premises in handcuffs. Take your time packing. Just do not scratch the dirt on your way out." "Thank you," I whispered, injecting a pathetic amount of gratitude into my voice. "Thank you so much, Brandon." He hung up without another word. I slowly lowered the receiver back onto the wall hook. The moment the plastic clicked into place, the tears completely vanished from my eyes. The trembling in my hands instantly ceased. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. He had swallowed the bait whole. He was so completely intoxicated by his own monumental ego and his desperate need to feel superior that he never bothered to question why I was giving up so easily. He never once thought to double-check the property lines or verify the local utility access codes. His profound arrogance had blinded him to the simplest rules of commercial real estate. By granting me that fake extension, Brandon unknowingly cemented his own catastrophic downfall. Because he truly believed I was completely neutralized, he felt absolutely no need to wait for the final official land surveys to clear before pushing forward with the corporate sale. He wanted his millions, and he wanted them right now. I called Harrison Cole immediately and relayed the entire conversation. The seasoned attorney chuckled darkly on the other end of the line. "Now we wait," Harrison said. "He is going to rush the corporate contract. He is going to demand a massive down payment to fund his new lifestyle. We just sit back and let him build his own financial gallows." Harrison's prediction was terrifyingly accurate. I learned the details of what happened next through a contact Harrison had inside the regional title company. Armed with my verbal surrender, Brandon contacted the executive team at Horizon Developments the very next morning. He played the role of the tough, uncompromising seller. He told them he had competing offers from other luxury developers. He falsely claimed that the land was entirely free of encumbrances and completely ready for immediate demolition. He pushed them to skip the standard 90-day due diligence period and sign a binding expedited purchase agreement immediately. Horizon Developments, being a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate hungry for prime suburban real estate, did not want to lose what they believed was a highly profitable location. They agreed to expedite the paperwork. 2 days later, Brandon signed a legally binding $2 million commercial purchase agreement. But my brother was greedy, and his greed required immediate satisfaction. He did not want to wait until the final closing date to start spending his stolen wealth. He instructed his slick lawyer to insert a highly aggressive clause into the purchase contract. To secure the property and prove they were serious buyers, Horizon Developments was required to provide a massive upfront earnest money deposit. He demanded $500,000. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, earnest money is a show of good faith. It proves the buyer has the liquid capital to close the deal. But there is a very strict, incredibly dangerous catch. If the seller willfully misrepresents the physical condition or the legal status of the property, the seller is legally obligated to return the entire earnest money deposit immediately, often with severe financial penalties attached. If the seller cannot return the money, they face massive civil lawsuits, corporate bankruptcy, and potential criminal charges for wire fraud. Horizon Developments wired $500,000 directly into Brandon's personal checking account that Friday afternoon. The moment the wire transfer cleared, the trap snapped completely shut. I did not have to hire a private investigator to find out how Brandon and Jessica were spending the corporate deposit. I only had to open my computer. Jessica simply could not help herself. She was a woman utterly consumed by the shallow, toxic pursuit of social status, and she desperately needed the entire world to know how incredibly wealthy she had suddenly become. I created a blank, anonymous social media profile and spent the next week quietly watching their digital footprint explode with rampant, reckless consumerism. The first photograph appeared on a Tuesday. It was a perfectly framed shot of Jessica's manicured hand resting casually on the steering wheel of a vehicle. The iconic crest of a brand-new Porsche 911 was gleaming in the center of the leather wheel. The caption read, "Upgrading our life. Hard work finally pays off." They had marched onto a luxury car lot and paid over $130,000 in pure cash for a sports car they did not need. 2 days later, a video was uploaded. Brandon and Jessica were standing on a magnificent glass-walled balcony overlooking the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago and the deep blue expanse of Lake Michigan. Brandon was popping a bottle of imported champagne while Jessica spun around in a designer silk dress. They were celebrating the signing of a massive real estate contract. They had just put a non-refundable $200,000 down payment on a $1.5 million luxury penthouse in one of the most exclusive residential towers in the city. If they failed to secure the final mortgage, or if the corporate farm sale somehow fell through, that $200,000 would be permanently forfeited to the building developers. The spending spree did not stop there. By the weekend, Jessica was posting screenshots of first-class flight confirmations and digital itineraries for a month-long ultra-luxury Mediterranean cruise. She posted photos of shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques filling the trunk of their new Porsche. Custom Italian furniture was ordered for the empty penthouse. Expensive vintage watches appeared on their wrists. They were burning through the corporate deposit money at a terrifying, absolutely staggering speed. I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my farm office, the soft glow of the computer monitor illuminating the severe, unsmiling lines of my face. I watched the video of my brother drinking expensive champagne on a Chicago balcony, celebrating wealth he had acquired by stealing from our dying father and attempting to throw me out onto the street. I thought about the sheer blinding arrogance required to spend $500,000 of corporate escrow money before a commercial real estate transaction had actually closed. Brandon believed he was untouchable. He believed he had permanently defeated the pathetic, dirt-stained sister who had spent 5 years working in the fields. He felt entirely secure in his stolen victory. But as I scrolled through the endless parade of their extravagant, reckless purchases, I did not feel angry anymore. I felt a profound, chilling sense of finality. The money was gone. The ink on the luxury contracts was completely dry. The dealership had their cash. The penthouse developers had their non-refundable deposit. Brandon had effectively severed his own safety net, gleefully locking himself inside a financial prison of his own making. He had spent the corporate earnest money. He could not give it back. I closed the laptop screen, plunging the small office into total darkness. The crickets chirped loudly outside the window, and the distant hum of a passing truck rolled down the nearby highway. Everything was perfectly in place. The grueling 5 years of sacrifice, the heartbreaking discovery of my father's forged signature, the terrifying morning of the surveyor invasion, it had all led to this precise, inescapable conclusion. My brother had demanded this war. He had chosen to play a game of ruthless financial domination. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the rules, and he had vastly underestimated his opponent. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet breathing of the old farmhouse, knowing with absolute certainty that the hellfire I was about to unleash upon his life would be spectacular, legally flawless, and completely merciless. While my brother was busy toasting his imaginary millions from a luxury high-rise balcony in Chicago, I was standing in the freezing Ohio mud at 2 a.m. wearing thick work gloves and a heavy canvas jacket. I had not slept more than a few hours in days, but I was running on a pure, electrifying cocktail of adrenaline and righteous vindication. Brandon thought he had successfully relegated me to the role of a defeated peasant. He assumed I was spending my final nights weeping into cardboard boxes, quietly packing away my shattered dreams. He was completely wrong. I was not packing my belongings. I was building an absolute fortress. I had hired a private, highly discreet local contracting crew to work the graveyard shift. I chose a team of guys who had helped me restore the main event barn 3 years ago. They knew me. They respected my work ethic, and they asked absolutely no questions when I offered them double their usual rate for an overnight rush job. The task was simple, but incredibly labor-intensive. They needed to erect a heavy-duty commercial-grade chain-link fence perfectly along the precise legally surveyed borders of my 2-acre parcel. The sounds of their diesel trucks and heavy machinery cutting through the silent, pitch-black night felt like beautiful music to my ears. I stood near the edge of the public highway holding a steaming thermos of black coffee, watching as the massive hydraulic post-hole diggers chewed through the damp earth. Every time the heavy steel blade bit into the soil, it felt like another nail being driven directly into Brandon's financial coffin. The crew worked with a synchronized, ruthless efficiency. They sank thick, galvanized steel posts deep into the ground, securing them permanently with fast-setting industrial concrete. Then came the heavy rolls of chain-link mesh, unspooled and stretched tight across the entire length of my property line. This was not a flimsy, decorative agricultural fence meant to keep stray deer out of a vegetable garden. This was an unyielding 10-foot-high commercial barrier, topped with intimidating angled brackets. By 4 a.m, the perimeter was completely sealed. But the crowning jewel of the entire operation was the main entrance. The long, winding gravel driveway that served as the sole point of access for the massive 50-acre farm was now completely bisected by my fence line. The contractors installed a massive heavy-duty, sliding steel gate directly across the road. It rolled shut with a heavy, satisfying metallic clang that echoed across the empty pastures. I pulled a thick, cut-resistant padlock from my jacket pocket, wrapped a hardened steel chain around the gate posts, and snapped the heavy lock securely into place. I grabbed a staple gun and a stack of stiff, bright red aluminum signs from the bed of my pickup truck. I walked the entire length of the newly constructed fence, methodically mounting the signs at eye level every 20 feet. Private property. Absolutely no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I hammered the staples into the posts with forceful, rhythmic strikes. I saved the largest sign for the very center of the locked steel gate blocking the driveway. I stepped back and shined my flashlight over the bold white letters reflecting brightly in the darkness. The physical trap was officially set. Brandon's $2 million inheritance was now locked behind an impenetrable wall of steel, and he did not even know it yet. The physical barrier was only the first half of my strategy. A corporate real estate developer might try to argue their way through a locked gate by claiming an implied historic right-of-way, but they could never argue with a dry pipeline. A luxury suburban subdivision cannot exist without a guaranteed massive and highly reliable water source. First thing Monday morning, before the local government offices even officially opened their doors to the public, I was sitting patiently in my truck in the parking lot of the County Water District headquarters. I had a thick manila folder resting on the passenger seat, containing every single piece of documentation proving my absolute uncontested legal ownership of the 2-acre parcel and the commercial deep water well situated perfectly within its boundaries. When the heavy glass doors finally unlocked, I walked straight to the main administrative desk. I politely but firmly requested the immediate termination and revocation of all implicit water-sharing agreements extending from my private well to the adjacent 50-acre agricultural property. The clerk behind the counter looked slightly confused at first. She typed my parcel number into her outdated computer system, squinting at the screen as she pulled up the historical zoning maps. She noted that the well had historically serviced the entire farm for decades. I smiled politely and informed her that the historical usage was completely irrelevant. The properties were now legally severed. The main 50-acre parcel was owned by Brandon Hayes, and I had absolutely no legal obligation nor any desire to provide his land with my private utility resources. Because there was no formal legally binding easement recorded in the county files, the clerk had no choice but to process my request. She stamped my paperwork with a heavy red seal, making the revocation official and permanent in the eyes of the local government. I drove straight from the county office back to my land. I walked out to the small concrete pump house that protected the massive commercial well system I had personally paid $15,000 to upgrade. I opened the heavy metal door and located the main directional valves that pushed the fresh water out toward the expansive greenhouse and the historic event barn on Brandon's side of the property line. I brought a heavy wrench and a set of specialized industrial caps I had purchased from the hardware store. It took an incredible amount of physical effort leaning my entire body weight against the wrench to break the rusted seals loose. My knuckles scraped against the rough concrete wall, drawing a thin line of blood, but I did not stop. I completely severed the connection. I fitted the thick metal caps over the outgoing pipes, tightening them down until the metal groaned under the pressure. I turned the main flow valves completely off and locked the pump house door securely behind me. I stood there in the quiet morning air, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. The lifeblood of the entire 50-acre farm was officially cut. Without that water, the beautiful green pastures would turn brown and die within weeks. Without that water, the massive barn had no working plumbing. Without that water, a corporate developer could not pour a single concrete foundation or secure a basic residential building permit. I had completely paralyzed the entire property. Brandon's glorious $2 million asset was now just a massive, useless patch of dry dirt hidden behind my locked steel gate. The true test of my fortress came exactly 2 days later. The air was crisp and cool, a beautiful, clear Tuesday morning. I was sitting on the hood of my dusty pickup truck, parked safely on my side of the new chain-link fence, sipping a hot cup of coffee and waiting for the inevitable collision. Harris & Cole had warned me that Horizon Developments moved aggressively once a contract was signed. They would not waste a single day before sending their people to begin the preliminary soil testing and environmental surveys required for their luxury subdivision. Right on schedule, a loud, heavy rumbling sound began to vibrate down the county highway. A massive flatbed semi-truck carrying a gigantic yellow industrial excavator slowed down and activated its flashing amber turn signal. Behind the semi-truck was a convoy of 3 sleek white corporate pickup trucks bearing the Horizon Developments logo on their doors. The convoy turned off the main asphalt and began to roll down the gravel approach to the farm. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my heart pounding a steady, exhilarating rhythm against my ribs. The lead pickup truck suddenly slammed on its brakes, the tires skidding loudly on the loose gravel. The entire convoy was forced to a violent, dusty halt, right in front of my 10-foot-high chain-link fence. The massive steel gate blocked the entire road, gleaming stubbornly in the morning sun, displaying my bright red no trespassing sign like a giant, uncompromising stop sign. A burly, red-faced man wearing a white hard hat and an orange safety vest stepped out of the lead truck. He was the site foreman, and he looked incredibly annoyed. He stomped up to the steel gate, grabbed the heavy chain, and yanked on the padlock angrily. When it did not budge, he peered through the metal mesh and spotted me sitting casually on the hood of my truck. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice rough and demanding. "Open this gate immediately. We have a signed, legally binding contract with the property owner to begin site development today. We have heavy machinery blocking the county road. Open it up right now." I did not move. I lowered my coffee mug and smiled at him. "I am sorry," I called back, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely unbothered. "You seem to be severely confused. You are attempting to enter private property. This land belongs exclusively to me, and I do not have a contract with your company. I suggest you turn your trucks around before I call the authorities." The foreman's face flushed an even deeper shade of angry red. He pulled a clipboard from his truck and waved it aggressively in the air. "Listen to me, lady," he barked loudly. "I do not have time for local neighbor disputes. We bought the 50 acres right behind you from Brandon Hayes. This driveway is our legal access point. If you do not unlock this gate in exactly 1 minute, I will have my excavator drive straight through it and tear it out of the ground." He was bluffing, trying to use corporate intimidation to steamroll a woman he assumed was just a stubborn local obstacle. But I had prepared for this exact moment. "Actually," I said, hopping down from the hood of my truck and walking slowly toward the fence line. "You will not be touching my gate, and you certainly will not be bringing that excavator onto my land." Just as the foreman opened his mouth to shout another threat, the distinct, highly authoritative wail of a police siren cut through the crisp morning air. A black and white county sheriff cruiser pulled off the highway and parked directly behind the corporate convoy, its blue and red lights flashing brightly. Sheriff Miller, a tall, imposing man who had known my family for 20 years, stepped out of his vehicle. I had visited his office the previous afternoon. I had sat at his desk, handed him a certified copy of my deed, the official county zoning map, and the approved construction permits for my new fence. I had explained precisely what Brandon was trying to do, and I had warned the sheriff that corporate developers would attempt to breach my property line today. Sheriff Miller adjusted his utility belt and walked slowly toward the furious foreman. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice low and carrying the absolute weight of the law. The foreman immediately pointed an accusing finger at me through the fence. "This woman is illegally blocking a commercial right-of-way," the foreman complained loudly. "We have a multi-million-dollar development project starting today on the Hayes farm, and she locked the only access gate. Tell her to open it, or we will bring the heavy equipment through." Sheriff Miller did not even look at me. He kept his stern gaze fixed entirely on the corporate foreman. "Let me stop you right there, son," the sheriff said firmly. "That gate is perfectly legal. This young lady owns the 2 acres you are currently standing on. I have personally reviewed her deed and the county plats. There is no recorded easement granting the 50-acre property behind her any legal right to cross this land." The foreman blinked, his aggressive posture immediately deflating into sheer, unadulterated confusion. "What do you mean there is no easement?" he sputtered, looking wildly from the sheriff to the locked gate. "How are we supposed to get our equipment to the site?" "That sounds like a massive problem between your corporate lawyers and the man who sold you a landlocked piece of property," Sheriff Miller replied coldly. "But if you or your heavy machinery touch a single link of that fence, or if you attempt to bypass this gate, I will arrest you and your entire crew for criminal trespassing and destruction of private property. Now I suggest you figure out how to back that massive semi-truck onto the highway, because you are currently loitering on a public right-of-way." The foreman stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open. The terrifying reality of the situation was rapidly sinking in. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed his corporate office. I could hear the panicked, urgent tone of his voice as he tried to explain to the Horizon Development's legal team that their $2 million purchase was completely inaccessible. I stood quietly on my side of the fence, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. The collision had happened exactly as I had planned. Horizon Developments was a ruthless corporate machine, and they were about to realize that Brandon had completely lied to them. He had promised them prime, ready-to-build real estate, and instead he had sold them a worthless, paralyzed patch of dirt with no road and no water. The corporate lawyers were going to tear him into absolute shreds. The bomb I had meticulously constructed in the dark was now officially ticking, and Brandon was sitting right on top of it, completely oblivious, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars he was about to owe back. The true reckoning was finally here, and I was going to enjoy every single second of his spectacular destruction. Horizon Developments occupied the top 3 floors of a towering, monolithic glass skyscraper in the very center of the city. The elevator ride felt like ascending into an entirely different atmosphere, my ears popping slightly as the sleek steel box rocketed upward toward the corporate heavens. Harrison Cole stood quietly beside me, his worn leather briefcase clutched firmly in his seasoned hands. He looked distinctly out of place in this cold, sterile temple of modern corporate wealth, but his eyes were incredibly sharp, glinting with the quiet, electrifying thrill of a master hunter who had his prey perfectly cornered. I wore my best dark trousers and a simple blazer, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. We were about to walk into a bloodbath, and I was holding the knife. The main receptionist guided us toward an expansive, incredibly intimidating glass-walled boardroom. We did not enter the room immediately. Harrison gently touched my arm and gestured for me to stand in the adjacent private waiting area. The space was separated by a wall of thick, soundproof glass that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive mahogany negotiation table. We stood in the quiet shadows, waiting for the execution to begin. A few minutes later, the heavy wooden doors on the opposite side of the boardroom swung open. Brandon and Jessica marched into the room like conquering royalty. The transformation in their physical appearance was absolutely staggering. Brandon was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that radiated aggressive new money. A thick, obscenely expensive vintage luxury watch rested heavy on his wrist, catching the bright overhead fluorescent lights every time he moved. Jessica practically floated beside him, draped head to toe in recognizable designer labels. She carried a limited edition leather handbag that likely cost more than a reliable car, and she placed a heavy set of keys bearing a famous sports car crest conspicuously on the table. She dropped into a plush leather executive chair with a smug, radiant smile plastered across her meticulously contoured face. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They were here to collect the final $1.5 million check. They firmly believed they were here to formalize the total slaughter of my farm and officially launch their new life of boundless, effortless luxury. A few moments later, the corporate executives from Horizon Developments filtered slowly into the room. There were absolutely no smiles on their faces. The lead counsel, a tall, incredibly imposing man with silver hair and a completely humorless, stone-cold expression, took his seat at the very head of the long table. He was flanked by 2 serious junior attorneys and a silent project manager. They carried thick stacks of manila folders and oversized property maps, dropping them onto the mahogany surface with heavy, ominous thuds. Brandon leaned forward with a blindingly arrogant smile, extending his hand for a confident peer-to-peer shake, remaining completely oblivious to the freezing, hostile temperature in the room. The lead counsel did not even look at Brandon. He completely ignored the outstretched hand opening his briefcase with sharp, aggressive snaps. Harrison tapped my shoulder lightly. "It is time," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble of authority. We walked out of the waiting area and pushed our way through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The soft click of the metal latch echoed incredibly loudly in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. Brandon turned his head toward the noise. His confident, blindingly arrogant smile instantly froze into a rigid mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He blinked rapidly, his eyes widening as if his brain completely refused to process my physical presence in this exclusive corporate sanctuary. "What are you doing here?" Brandon demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he quickly forced it back into a tone of dominant, furious authority. He stood up abruptly from his leather chair, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "You have absolutely no business being here, Abby. This is a private corporate closing. You need to turn around and leave this building right now." Jessica scoffed loudly, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive silk blouse. "Security needs to escort her out," she announced to the room, rolling her eyes in a theatrical display of exaggerated annoyance. "She is just a disgruntled former tenant throwing a pathetic tantrum. Please ignore her, gentlemen. She is practically a peasant looking for a handout." I did not step back. I did not shrink away from their toxic superiority. I stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my hands resting completely calm at my sides. I looked directly into my brother's panicked eyes, letting a slow, incredibly cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I am exactly where I need to be, Brandon," I said quietly, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Before my brother could unleash another torrent of arrogant demands, the lead counsel for Horizon Developments cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, abrasive, and completely commanding, instantly snapping the attention of the entire room back to the head of the table. "Sit down." Mr. Hayes, the corporate attorney, ordered, his voice laced with absolute uncompromising venom. "Miss Hayes and her legal counsel have every single right to be in this room today. In fact, we explicitly invited them to attend this closing." Brandon stared at this attorney, his face contorting with profound, desperate confusion. "Invited them," he repeated, his voice completely losing its confident corporate edge. "Why in the world would you invite her? She has zero equity in the property. I hold the sole legal deed to the land. I am the sole seller. You and I have a binding $2 million contract." The lead counsel let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh that held absolutely no warmth. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, terrifyingly thick stack of legal documents. He slammed the entire file onto the polished glass table with such violent force that Jessica physically jumped in her leather chair. "We do not have a contract, Mr. Hayes," the attorney snarled, his professional demeanor completely giving way to raw, unfiltered corporate fury. "We have a massive, unmitigated financial disaster, and you have committed what legally amounts to gross corporate misrepresentation." Brandon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his crisp white collar. "I do not understand what you are talking about," he stammered, the first genuine notes of fear bleeding into his voice. "The land is perfectly clear. The title is completely clean. I gave you a fully documented 30-day notice of eviction for the current tenant. The site is entirely ready for immediate demolition." The attorney picked up a large, rolled architectural blueprint and shoved it violently across the smooth table directly toward my brother. "Our final title survey just cleared this morning," the lawyer said, his voice rising with every devastating syllable. "Our municipal engineers spent the past 48 hours desperately trying to untangle the absolute geographic nightmare you tried to sell us. Do you know what they found, Mr. Hayes? Do you have any idea what you actually own?" Brandon stared blindly at the blueprint, his eyes darting frantically across the complex black lines and topographical symbols he clearly did not understand. "It is 50 acres of prime real estate," Brandon insisted, sweat beginning to bead heavily on his pale forehead. "It is perfectly zoned for luxury residential development. It is 50 acres of completely landlocked, legally inaccessible, absolutely worthless dirt," the attorney roared, leaning entirely over the table. "You do not own the frontage property. You do not own the access road. The only driveway connecting your magnificent 50-acre farm to the public state highway is located entirely on a separate privately owned 2-acre parcel, a completely independent parcel that belongs exclusively to your sister." Jessica let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. She turned her head slowly, staring at me with wide, completely terrified eyes. The smug superior arrogance that had defined her entire existence was rapidly evaporating into sheer unadulterated panic. There is absolutely no recorded easement. The lead counsel continued methodically driving the final lethal nails into Brandon's financial coffin. There is no legal right-of-way. We sent a heavy machinery crew to your property 3 days ago to begin our preliminary soil testing. Do you know what they found? They found a 10-foot-high commercial steel gate locked straight across the driveway. They found the local county sheriff standing guard, explicitly threatening to arrest our corporate contractors for criminal trespassing if they touched a single blade of grass. You sold us a massive development site that we cannot even legally walk onto. Brandon's face was completely drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just been violently shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. "That is impossible," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "The driveway has been there for decades. It is a shared family road. We can just draft a simple easement right now. I will force her to sign it." Harrison Cole stepped forward, smoothly pulling his own immaculate stack of documents from his worn leather briefcase. "You cannot force my client to sign anything," Mr. Hayes Harrison stated, his voice incredibly calm, steady, and devastatingly precise. "Miss Hayes purchased that frontage parcel with her own personal funds 4 years ago at a county tax auction. It is completely independent of your father's estate. She has zero legal obligation to grant you commercial access. Furthermore, she has absolutely no intention of negotiating with you or your corporate buyers. The road is permanently closed, but the road is only half of your massive problem." The Horizon attorney interrupted, completely stripping Brandon of his last remaining shred of hope. "Our surveyors pulled the county utility records yesterday afternoon. A luxury residential subdivision requires massive, highly reliable water infrastructure. Do you know where the main commercial well for your entire farm is actually located, Mr. Hayes?" Brandon did not answer. He was audibly hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the sleek boardroom as the invisible walls of his elaborate, arrogant scheme rapidly crushed him from all sides. "The well sits exactly 10 feet inside your sister's private property line," the corporate lawyer stated, his tone dropping into a cold, clinical execution. "And earlier this week, the county water district officially processed her paperwork revoking all implied water sharing to the main farm. She capped the commercial pipes. She completely cut off the supply. Your 50 acres has absolutely no legal water rights." The attorney tossed a final official-looking document onto the table. It slid across the glass and landed directly in front of Jessica, who recoiled from the paper as if it was physically on fire. Consequently, the lawyer finished smoothly. "The county zoning board officially convened this morning. They have explicitly and permanently denied our applications for all residential subdivision permits. A developer cannot build 100 luxury homes on a property that completely lacks both road access and municipal water. The land is legally paralyzed. It is completely undeniably useless to us." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly beautiful. Brandon sat entirely frozen in his custom-tailored suit, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing a single sound. He looked exactly like a fish suffocating on dry land. The grand, magnificent illusion of his wealth, his superiority, and his brilliant corporate triumph had been completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Jessica stared at this blueprint on the table, her hands shaking violently. "But the penthouse," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure selfish terror. "We already put down the $200,000 deposit for the Chicago penthouse. We bought a Porsche with cash. We booked the Mediterranean cruise. We need that final corporate check today. You cannot cancel the sale. We have binding contracts." The lead counsel for Horizon Developments looked at Jessica with an expression of absolute unvarnished corporate disgust. "We are not just canceling the sale," Mrs. Hayes, the attorney, said coldly, straightening his tie. "We are officially terminating the purchase agreement under the gross misrepresentation clause. You deliberately concealed massive lethal title defects. You lied about the physical access to the land. And because you engaged in corporate fraud, the financial terms of our contract are exceptionally clear. The attorney leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the glass table looming over my brother. "We want our $500,000 earnest money deposit returned to our corporate accounts immediately," he demanded, his voice ringing like a judge handing down a death sentence. "We want it fully refunded by the close of business tomorrow. If the funds are not returned in full, Horizon Developments will file a massive civil lawsuit against you for corporate fraud, breach of contract, and extensive legal damages. We will place heavy liens on all your personal assets. We will garnish your future wages, and we will absolutely bankrupt you for the rest of your natural life." The sheer magnitude of their destruction hung heavily in the sleek corporate air. Brandon had spent the money. He had burned through $500,000 of corporate escrow funds in less than 2 weeks, entirely blinded by his own toxic ego and his insatiable greed. He had bought luxury cars and penthouses he could never actually afford. Now the absolute reality of the bill was completely due, and his pockets were entirely empty. I stood quietly beside my attorney, watching my brother realize that the very trap he had confidently set for me had just violently, permanently decapitated his entire life. He had thought I was a peasant. He had thought my tears on the telephone were a sign of absolute surrender. He never realized that I was just patiently waiting in the mud, holding the geographical noose entirely ready, waiting for him to step right into the center of the trap and hang himself. The lead counsel for Horizon Developments leaned across the polished mahogany table, his silver pen tapping a lethal, steady rhythm against the glass. He did not yell. He did not need to. His voice was a low, terrifying hum of absolute corporate power, and every single syllable he spoke systematically dismantled my brother's entire life. "Mr. Hayes," the attorney began, his eyes fixed on Brandon with the detached disgust of someone scraping mud off their shoe. "You signed a binding legal affidavit stating this property had clear, unencumbered access to state and local infrastructure. You actively and deliberately concealed a fatal geographical defect to secure a $500,000 earnest money deposit. In this state, and under federal banking regulations inducing a wire transfer across state lines, using deliberate misrepresentation is not just a simple breach of contract. It is wire fraud. It is a federal felony." Brandon sat entirely paralyzed. The smug, arrogant glow he had carried into the room had completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sickly ashen gray pallor. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords seemed completely frozen. Jessica gripped the arms of her plush leather chair so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. The heavy designer keys to the brand-new Porsche sat on the table between them, suddenly looking less like a trophy and more like a glowing radioactive piece of criminal evidence. "We are terminating this acquisition immediately." The lawyer continued, snapping his heavy briefcase shut with a sharp echoing crack that made Brandon jump. "You have exactly 24 hours to wire the $500,000 deposit back into our corporate escrow account. If those funds are not fully cleared by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, my firm will file a massive civil suit for punitive damages. Simultaneously, we will forward your signed affidavits and the wire transfer records directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will be looking at millions in legal penalties and up to 20 years in federal prison." Brandon finally found his voice, but it was nothing more than a pathetic, wet squeak. "You cannot do that," he stammered, raising his trembling hands in a futile gesture of surrender. "You cannot just demand it back tomorrow. I do not have it sitting in cash. We invested it. We put it into real estate." Jessica let out a horrifying, strangled sob. The penthouse, she whispered, tears instantly spilling over and ruining her immaculate, expensive makeup. The $200,000 down payment was non-refundable. The dealership took cash for the car. The cruise lines. Brandon, the money is gone. It is all gone. The Horizon attorneys did not show a single ounce of pity. They stood up in unison, buttoning their expensive suit jackets with practiced, synchronized indifference. "That sounds like a catastrophic personal problem," Mr. Hayes, the lead counsel, said coldly. "I suggest you call a bankruptcy lawyer immediately. We will see you in federal court." They turned to leave the glass-walled boardroom. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. This was the precise collision I had spent 5 agonizing years earning. I stepped forward, moving directly into the path of the departing corporate lawyers. "Wait," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the massive, tense room. "Nobody needs to call the FBI today. I have a solution that gets everyone exactly what they want." The lead counsel paused, looking down at me with a mixture of profound irritation and cautious curiosity. Brandon whipped his head around, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and frantic. "Shut up, Abby," Brandon hissed, reverting to his old desperate cruelty even as his entire life burned to the ground around him. "You have done enough. You ruined this. Just get out." I ignored him completely. I looked directly at the Horizon attorneys, projecting the calm, grounded authority of a woman who held the only remaining key to the kingdom. "Gentlemen," I said smoothly, "I know for a fact that Horizon Developments owns a massive 300-acre plot of undeveloped commercial land directly adjacent to the western boundary of my farm. I know your company has been struggling for 2 years to secure a secondary access road for that western project because the county keeps denying your highway permits." The lead counsel narrowed his eyes, his posture shifting subtly. He stepped back toward the table, his professional curiosity officially piqued. "Go on," he said cautiously. "I own the 2 acres of frontage property bordering the highway." I continued, my voice steady and completely unwavering. "I own the only viable entrance to this entire valley. If you drop the lawsuit against my brother, and if you completely waive the return of the $500,000 earnest money deposit, I will grant Horizon Developments a permanent, legally binding commercial easement across my land. You can build your massive access road straight through my gates to reach your western project. That easement alone is worth 10 times the deposit you lost today. It will unlock tens of millions of dollars in future revenue for your company." The Horizon attorneys looked at each other, silent communication passing rapidly between them. They knew I was right. A permanent commercial access easement in this county was practically priceless. It would save their stalled Western development project entirely. "We would accept those terms," the lead counsel finally said, nodding slowly. "But that does not solve the issue of the 50-acre farm. Your brother still owns it, and it is still completely landlocked." I turned slowly, pivoting on my heel to face Brandon. My brother was staring at me, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down the sides of his face. He looked absolutely terrified. "That brings us to you, Brandon," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, uncompromising steel. I reached into Harrison Cole's leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had assembled in the dead of night. I walked over to where Brandon was sitting and slammed the folder down onto the glass table right next to the keys to his ridiculous sports car. I opened the cover. The faded, yellowed bank statements from 5 years ago stared back at him. On top of the stack was the carbon copy of the wire transfer authorization bearing the flawless forged signature of our dying father. Brandon looked down at the documents. All the remaining color drained completely out of his face, leaving him looking like a literal corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "I know exactly what you did," I said, leaning down so my face was inches from his. "I spent 5 years breaking my back to pay off a tax debt that you deliberately created. You forged Dad's signature while his mind was failing. You stole $8,000 from his emergency medical fund to pay off your underwater margin calls in Chicago. You left him to face foreclosure, and you left me to clean up your sickening mess." Jessica gasped, shrinking back into her expensive leather chair as if Brandon was suddenly contagious. "You forged documents," she whispered in horror. "You stole from a sick old man." "Shut up, Jessica," Brandon snapped weakly, though his voice lacked any real venom. He looked back at me, his eyes brimming with panicked tears. "Abby, please." I was desperate. The brokers were going to ruin me. I meant to pay it back. I swear to you, I was going to pay it back. "But you did not," I replied coldly, feeling absolutely zero pity for the sobbing man in front of me. "You came back 5 years later and tried to steal the business I built with my own bare hands. You called me a peasant. You told me I was nothing but free labor." I stood up straight, letting the full crushing weight of reality settle over the boardroom. "So here is your only way out. Brandon, I declared, my voice ringing with finality, you are currently facing federal wire fraud charges from Horizon Developments. You are facing a massive civil lawsuit that will bankrupt you forever. And if I take these forged bank statements to the district attorney, you are facing felony elder abuse and forgery charges. You will spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. Brandon began to weep openly. Large, ugly tears rolled down his face and dripped onto his expensive custom suit. What do you want? He sobbed, raising his hands in total surrender. Just tell me what you want. Harrison Cole stepped forward, pulling a single crisp legal document from his briefcase. He placed it on the table directly in front of Brandon, uncapping a heavy silver fountain pen and laying it precisely next to the signature line. This is a quitclaim deed, I explained, watching my brother stare at the paper like it was a loaded weapon. You are going to sign the entire 50-acre farm over to me right now. Every single blade of grass, every single building. You will relinquish all legal rights to the property permanently. In exchange, I will sign the easement agreement with Horizon, saving you from their lawsuit and the $500,000 debt. And I will bury these forged bank statements so you do not go to prison for robbing our father. Jessica let out a wail of absolute despair. You cannot do this, she cried, grabbing Brandon's arm. That farm is worth $2 million. We will have absolutely nothing. The Chicago penthouse, the cars, it will all be gone. It was never yours to begin with, Jessica, I said, looking down at her with absolute disgust. You built a fantasy life on stolen money and unearned arrogance. Now you get to go back to reality. I looked back at my brother. Sign the paper, Brandon. Or I let the corporate lawyers call the FBI right this second. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The only sound was Brandon's jagged, heavy breathing. He looked at the Horizon attorneys who stood nearby with their arms crossed, completely unsympathetic to his plight. He looked at Harrison Cole, who watched him with the stern, unforgiving gaze of a seasoned judge. And finally, he looked at me. He saw no mercy in my eyes. He saw the 5 years of grueling, agonizing labor he had forced upon me. He saw the freezing winters, the blistered hands, and the sleepless nights. With a trembling, shaking hand, Brandon reached out and picked up the silver fountain pen. Wait, he whispered, a final, pathetic shred of greed surfacing through his tears. If I sign this, the contract says a purchase price is required for the deed transfer. What are you paying me for the $2 million farm? I reached into my pocket, pulled out a personal check, and dropped it onto the glass table next to the deed. $8,000, I said coldly. Exactly what you owe me. Brandon closed his eyes, a fresh wave of tears spilling down his cheeks. He pressed the pen to the paper and slowly, agonizingly, signed his name. He signed away his $2 million inheritance. He signed away his lavish Chicago future. He surrendered his entire fraudulent empire for exactly $8,000. Harrison Cole quickly pulled the deed away, stamping it with his official notary seal, before sliding it safely into his briefcase. The transaction was complete. It was legally binding and entirely irreversible. The lead counsel for Horizon Development stepped forward, sliding an easement agreement across the table toward me. I signed it without hesitation, granting them the road access they desperately needed for their Western project, officially neutralizing their legal threat against my brother. The corporate attorneys nodded their heads in silent professional respect, gathered their briefcases, and walked out of the boardroom without sparing Brandon another glance. Brandon and Jessica sat alone at the massive table. They were completely ruined. The $500,000 corporate deposit was gone, swallowed up by non-refundable luxury purchases they could no longer afford to maintain. Their Chicago penthouse would be repossessed. Their brand-new Porsche would be seized by creditors. They would have to return to their small apartment buried in crushing debt, stripped of their pride, and forced to face the miserable, empty reality of their own toxic choices. I picked up the manila folder containing the forged bank statements, tucked it under my arm, and turned to leave. Abby Brandon called out weakly as I reached the heavy glass doors. His voice was a pathetic, shattered whisper. What are we supposed to do now? We have nothing. I stopped and looked back over my shoulder at the man who had almost destroyed my life. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The familial bond had been permanently severed the day he decided his own greed was more important than our father's life. "You should figure it out, Brandon," I said, echoing the exact same words he had casually thrown at me 5 years ago. "You are a smart guy. You will adapt. Just do not scratch the dirt on your way out." I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped onto the bustling city sidewalk. The sun was shining brightly, cutting through the crisp autumn air. I took a deep, unrestricted breath, feeling a massive, incredible weight lift completely off my shoulders. I was not just a tenant anymore. I was not a glorified peasant or a victim of corporate greed. I was the sole, undisputed owner of Oak Creek Farm. I had protected my father's legacy. I had saved my business, and I had secured my future on my own uncompromising terms. I want to pause right here and ask all of you a question. If you found out your own sibling had stolen from your dying parent, would you have sent them to prison, or would you have taken their inheritance like I did? Tell me your honest thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching a greedy, entitled family member get exactly what they deserve, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more of these incredible stories of justice to light. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the truth always catches up with those who run from it. Stay strong and take care of yourselves. The sheer velocity of corporate financial ruin is a truly terrifying thing to witness. When you build an entire existence on a fragile foundation of stolen money, forged signatures, and blinding arrogance, the inevitable collapse does not happen slowly over time. It happens all at once, violently, and without a single ounce of mercy. Horizon Developments was not a company that made empty threats in glass-walled boardrooms. True to their word, their massive legal team unleashed an absolute hurricane of aggressive litigation the very morning after our negotiation. They filed a comprehensive civil suit in the state court, immediately freezing every single one of my brother's personal and business bank accounts. They placed heavy legal liens on anything bearing his name, ensuring that he could not hide or transfer a single penny of his remaining assets. The $500,000 earnest money deposit had to be repaid immediately, but Brandon had already squandered a terrifying portion of it on luxury items he could not instantly liquidate. The consequences arrived at his doorstep with brutal, mundane efficiency. It started with the brand new Porsche. Brandon and Jessica were desperately sitting in their expensive short-term rental house, frantically calling cheap defense attorneys who demanded massive upfront retainers they could no longer afford, when a heavy-duty commercial tow truck backed loudly into their pristine driveway. Jessica threw open the front mahogany door, still wearing her designer silk bathrobe, and began screaming wildly at the repossession agents to stop touching her car. But the vehicle financing company had already been formally notified of the frozen bank assets. The agents simply handed Brandon a plastic clipboard holding a notice of default, hooked heavy steel chains to the undercarriage of the luxury sports car, and dragged it away down the wet suburban street. Jessica stood shivering on the damp concrete, watching her ultimate status symbol disappear into the morning traffic, realizing for the very first time that the party was officially and permanently over. The luxury real estate developers in downtown Chicago were even less forgiving than the car dealership. When Brandon failed to produce the massive remaining funds required for the final penthouse closing, the developers instantly terminated the purchase contract. The $200,000 down payment they had wired just days earlier was strictly non-refundable. It vanished completely into the corporate accounts of the Chicago development firm, legally forfeited, due to a blatant breach of contract. All the custom Italian leather furniture they had enthusiastically ordered was summarily canceled. The first-class plane tickets and the reservations for their month-long Mediterranean luxury cruise were surrendered at a massive financial loss. Within a matter of 14 short days, my brother went from a self-proclaimed multi-millionaire to a man drowning in an insurmountable, suffocating ocean of debt. Jessica was a woman who required a constant, steady diet of immense wealth and public admiration to survive. The moment the designer shopping bags stopped arriving at the door, and the moment the credit cards began declining at upscale restaurants, her marriage vows completely evaporated. She did not stay to comfort him through the crisis. She did not offer to get a job to help pay down the crushing legal penalties. Instead, she turned her venomous anger entirely on him. She packed her remaining expensive clothes into a set of matching designer suitcases, called an upscale private car service, and left him sitting entirely alone in an empty living room. The official divorce papers arrived less than 3 weeks later. She cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone in their shallow social circle knew the actual translation. She was completely unwilling to stick around for a man who could no longer fund her wild delusions of grandeur. She hired a ruthless divorce attorney to protect her own remaining personal assets, eagerly feeding Brandon to the corporate wolves to save her own skin. The corporate consulting world is incredibly small and fiercely protective of its pristine reputation. Once the dark rumors of his fraudulent real estate dealings and his incredibly narrow escape from federal wire fraud charges began to circulate through the industry, his professional network completely abandoned him. He instantly became a toxic asset. Nobody wanted a man who had stolen money from his dying father, managing their important corporate portfolios. Stripped entirely of his professional credentials, abandoned by his wife and buried under a towering mountain of court-ordered restitution payments to Horizon Developments, Brandon was forced to take whatever menial work he could find just to survive. Today, the man who once mocked my dirt-stained work jeans and called me a glorified peasant wakes up at 4 a.m. to the shrill buzzing of a cheap plastic alarm clock. He puts on a stiff polyester uniform and rides a crowded city bus because he can no longer afford the insurance on a personal vehicle. He works as a mid-level shift manager at a regional logistics warehouse on the gritty industrial side of the city. He spends his long, exhausting days managing heavy inventory pallets, listening to the deafening roar of forklifts, and dealing with angry truck drivers. Every single Friday, an aggressive, legally mandated portion of his meager paycheck is automatically garnished by the court system to pay off the massive financial penalties he still owes. He lives in a tiny, depressing apartment with thin walls and faded carpets. He has absolutely nothing to show for his profound arrogance except a lifetime of humiliating, inescapable debt. Back in Ohio, my life looks entirely different. I step out onto the wide, wraparound wooden porch of the main farmhouse. The evening air is crisp, cool, and incredibly fragrant, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of blooming night jasmine and rich, fertile soil. I lean my arms against the sturdy wooden railing, wrapping my hands around a warm ceramic mug of apple cider, and look out over the sprawling, magnificent 50 acres that finally, undeniably, and legally belong exclusively to me. The official property deed is sitting safely framed on the wall inside my quiet home office. It no longer bears the name of a cowardly brother who abandoned this family when things got difficult. It no longer carries the heavy, tragic weight of a dying man's forged signature. The thick, heavy legal document features my name in bold black ink, Chloe Abigail Hayes. It is a single piece of paper, but it represents 5 grueling years of agonizing sacrifice, blistering summer heat, freezing winter mornings, and an ultimate brilliant victory. I bought this precious land twice. I bought it the first time with my sweat and my tears, and I bought it the second time with my patience and my intelligence. The sun is slowly setting over the western tree line, casting a brilliant, warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawns. The farm is absolutely thriving, pulsing with a vibrant, renewed energy. The deep commercial well located securely and permanently on my private 2-acre frontage parcel hums quietly in the distance. It pushes fresh, clean water through the repaired irrigation pipes, feeding the lush organic pastures and the sprawling glass greenhouse. My heirloom tomato crops, entirely recovered from the brief and chaotic corporate surveyor invasion, are producing a record-breaking autumn harvest. I hired 3 new local employees this season, just to keep up with the incredible demand from the surrounding restaurants. Tonight, the farm is doing exactly what it was always meant to do. A massive, joyful wedding celebration is in full swing. The historic, beautifully restored 19th century barn is completely illuminated by thousands of twinkling fairy lights draped gracefully from the heavy, ancient wooden rafters. A lively acoustic band is playing a cheerful, upbeat tune that drifts softly across the peaceful evening breeze. Guests in beautiful dresses and sharp suits are laughing, dancing, and enjoying the rustic, safe sanctuary I fought so incredibly hard to protect. The catering staff, my loyal and hardworking team who stood by me during the darkest days of the eviction threat, are moving seamlessly through the happy crowd, serving delicious meals made directly from the very organic vegetables we grew in this soil. I watch a young, radiant bride twirl gracefully on the polished wooden dance floor, her white dress catching the warm amber light, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. There are no more corporate bulldozers waiting aggressively at the front gates. There are no more arrogant lawyers sitting in glass boardrooms threatening to destroy my livelihood. The heavy chain-link fence I built in the dark has been carefully removed, replaced by beautiful, welcoming wrought iron gates that swing open freely for my clients. There is only the beautiful, quiet rhythm of a highly successful business and a profoundly safe home. I did not just save a valuable piece of commercial property. I saved my father's true, enduring legacy. I protected the very beating heart of this family land from the toxic, consuming greed of a man who only saw dollar signs where there was deep history and vibrant life. I stood my ground against seemingly impossible odds, armed with absolutely nothing but a manila folder full of hidden truth and an unwavering, unbreakable determination to see justice served. When I close my eyes and listen to the music floating across the fields, I know that all the sleepless nights, all the moments of suffocating panic, and all the agonizing physical labor were entirely worth it. I am no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. I am no longer trapped in a corner by someone else's malicious deceit. I am exactly where I belong, rooted firmly in the earth I cultivated, standing completely free under the wide open sky. Greed might help someone steal a piece of paper, but it can never steal the true value built by honest sweat and intelligence. The boundaries you set today are the armor that will protect your future tomorrow. Have you ever had to use the law to protect your hard work from the greed of your own family? I want to hear your story in the comments. Please do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know what state you are watching from and what time it is there. I will see you in the next story. You deserve to be protected.